welcome everyone in attendance. The committee has under consideration the estimates of the Ministry of Children's Services for the fiscal year ending March 31st, 2023. I'd ask that we go around the table and have members introduce themselves for the record. Minister, please introduce the officials who are joining you at the table.
Good morning, everybody. Joining me this morning, we have Children's Services Deputy Minister Sherry Wilson, Assistant Deputy Minister for Child Intervention Delivery Leanne Wagner, the Assistant Deputy Minister for Child Care and Youth Services Joni Brodziak, and Senior Financial Officer Darren Baptista. In the gallery, Madam Chair, we also have Assistant Deputy Minister for Indigenous Partnerships and Strategic Services, Cynthia Dunnigan, and Assistant Deputy Minister for Regulatory Compliance, Quality Assurance, and Business Support, Michael Walter, as well as our Director of Communications, Nancy Bichet.
Thank you, Minister. My name is Jackie Lovely, and I'm the MLA for the Camrose constituency and the chair of this committee. We will begin starting to my right.
Good morning, Grant Hunter from Tabor Warner.
Good morning, Mark Smith, Drayton Valley, Devon.
Good morning, Michaela Fry, MLA Brooks Medicine Hat.
Good morning, Devinder Toor, MLA Calgary Falconridge.
Good morning, Jason Steffen, MLA Red Deer South.
Good morning, Laurie Sigurdsson, Edmonton Riverview.
Good morning, Raki Pancholi, Edmonton Whitemud.
Now we'll go to the members participating remotely. Please go ahead, Member Amory. That was Mickey Amory, so he's just having some technical difficulties. We'll hear from him in a few minutes. I'd like to note the following substitutions for the record. Mr. Toor will be substituting for Mr. Reid, and Mr. Steppen will be substituting for Mr. Gottfried for a portion of the meeting. A few housekeeping items to address before we turn to the business at hand. Please note that the microphones are operated by Hansard. Committee proceedings are being live streamed on the internet and broadcast on Alberta Assembly TV. The audio and visual stream transcripts of meetings can be accessed via the Legislative Assembly website. Members participating remotely are encouraged to have your camera on while speaking and your microphone muted when not speaking. Remote participants who wish to be placed on a speaker's list are asked to email or send a message in the group chat to the committee clerk, and members in the room are asked to please signal to the chair. Please set your cell phones and other devices to silent for the duration of the meeting. All right, just one moment, please. Sorry. Honourable members, the standing order set out on the process for consideration of the main estimates. A total of 3 hours has been scheduled for consideration of the estimates for the Ministry of Children's Services. Standing Order 59017 establishes the speaking rotation and speaking times. In brief, the Minister or a member of the Executive Council acting on the Minister's behalf will have 10 minutes to address the committee. At the conclusion of the Minister's comments, a 60-minute speaking block for the official opposition begins, followed by a 20-minute speaking block for independent members, if any, and then a 20-minute speaking block for the Government Caucus. Individuals may only speak for up to 10 minutes at a time, but time may be combined between the member and the Minister. After this rotation of speaking time, will then follow the same rotation for the official opposition, independent members, and the Government Caucus, with individual speaking times set to 5 minutes for both the member and the ministry. These times may be combined, making it a 10-minute block. If members have any questions regarding speaking times or the rotation, please feel free to send an email or message to the committee clerk about the process. With the concurrence of the committee, I will call a 5-minute break near the midpoint of the meeting. However, the 3-hour clock will continue to run. Does anyone have any opposition to a break? All right, hearing none. Ministry officials may be present and at the direction of the minister may address the committee. Ministry officials seated in the gallery, if called upon, have access to a microphone in the gallery area and are asked to please introduce themselves for the record prior to commenting. Pages are available to deliver notes or other materials between the gallery and the table. Attendees in the gallery may not approach the table. Space permitting, opposition caucus staff may sit at the table to assist their members. However, members have priority to sit at the table at all times. If debate is exhausted prior to 3 hours, the ministry's estimates are deemed to have been considered for the time allotted in the schedule and the committee will adjourn. Points of order will be dealt with as they arise, and individual speaking times will be paused. However, the speaking block time and the overall 2-hour meeting clock will continue to run. Any written materials provided in response to questions raised during the main estimates should be tabled by the minister in the Assembly for the benefit of all members. The vote on estimates and any amendments will occur in Committee on Supply on March 21st, 2022. Amendments must be in writing and approved by Parliamentary Council prior to the meeting at which they are to be moved. The original amendment is to be deposited with the committee clerk with 20 hard copies. An electronic version of the signed original should be provided to the committee clerk for distribution to committee members. Finally, the committee should have the opportunity to hear questions and answers without interruption during estimate debate. Debate flows through the chair, please, at all time, including instances when speaking time is shared between a member and the minister. I would now invite the Minister of Children's Services to begin her opening remarks.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, it is my pleasure to present the 2022 budget estimates and 2022 to 25 business plan for the Ministry of Children's Services. Joining me this morning, as I've already introduced, are officials from the ministry. So as they're in the record, I will not introduce them again, but I'm very grateful for the work that they do and for them being here with me this morning. Madam Chair, Budget 2022 is great news for Albertans. We are moving Alberta forward by getting more Albertans working and bringing our finances back into the black. A balanced budget and a strong economy are crucial for the well-being of children and families, Madam Chair, because they enable us to care for our most vulnerable. Alberta has programs and services that ensure all kids and youth are safe, supported, and set up for success. We also have a childcare system that makes it possible for working parents to benefit from Alberta's economic recovery. My ministry's 3-year business plan, starting in 2022-23, sets out how we will work to meet the ministry's objectives. The first of these objectives is to improve access to a range of licensed early learning and childcare options for parents right across Alberta so that they can go to work knowing their kids are safe and supported. The second objective, Madam Chair, is to ensure the well-being, resiliency, and cultural connections of children, youth, and families are supported and children and youth are protected. We're improving access to early intervention and prevention services to keep families unified, strong, and connected with their communities and their culture. For situations where it isn't safe for children in their homes, we are also strengthening caregiver supports and training so that those who provide loving temporary homes for children and youth can give them the best possible care. And our third objective, Madam Chair, is to cut red tape that creates unnecessary barriers and administrative burdens for families, organizations, and businesses that rely on our services. This involves modernizing legislation and making it easier for Albertans to interact with government. Madam Chair, to do all of this, I am happy to report a more than 39% increase in funding for children's services. That extra $700 million, Madam Chair, will help us transform our childcare system, support parents as they get back to work, and help families and communities flourish. It brings total funding in 22-23 to $2.4 billion, and I'd like to break down how Children's Services is allocating these dollars in this fiscal year. Madam Chair, a strong childcare system is more vital than ever as the economy recovers and parents head back to work. Today being International Women's Day, I think it's also fitting to mention that this also helps women get back to work or access post-secondary opportunities, especially as we come out of the pandemic. As inflation and the cost of living rise, families are looking for help with their childcare fees, and the sector is looking for growth and stability. Madam Chair, the historic $3.8 billion Alberta Canada Early Learning and Childcare Agreement with the federal government respects parent choice, includes our mixed market of private and not-for-profit operators, and is designed to meet the diverse needs of families and childcare operators alike. This Made in Alberta deal will help us lower the average cost of licensed childcare in Alberta to an average of $10 a day over the next 5 years by 2026. This is incredible news to parents throughout the province. Budget 2022 invests more than $1 billion in early learning and childcare. $350 million of this is provincial funding, and $734 million is federal funding from 2 separate agreements. Our main focus, Madam Chair, for 2022-23 is reducing childcare fees so that all families start seeing savings right away. We've expanded our childcare subsidy program so that families with incomes under $180,000 are now also eligible for an additional subsidy. We're also rolling out affordability grants to licensed operators participating in the federal funding agreement. The grants and subsidy are working together to lower parent fees by an average of 50% in 2022. These dollars have already started to roll out. Although Alberta was one of the last provinces to sign an agreement with the federal government, I'm so proud to say that we were one of the first 2 provinces to roll out affordability dollars and make sure that there are savings for Alberta parents and families. Through separate funding, we're also providing subsidy supports for families with older children who need out-of-school care. In September 2021, families earning up to $90,000 became eligible for subsidy, which was up from the previous threshold of up to $75,000 of household income a year. We also continue to support all licensed operators with workforce development funding so they can recruit, retain, and train certified educators. Budget 2022 allocates about $120 million to maintain one of the highest wage top-ups in Canada for early childhood educators. There is also $56 million in funding budgeted for workforce supports in 2021-22 to help centres recruit and retain the best staff and provide the quality of care that parents in their communities expect. Over the next 3 years, Madam Chair, $300 million in funding is allocated for wage top-ups, professional development, and training for early childhood educators. We are working with operators to determine the best use of this investment. We'll also work with cross-ministry partners and post-secondary institutions to build capacity in the childcare workforce so we have the qualified staff to support the new spaces and inclusive programming that are included in this plan. Madam Chair, as always, the safety and protection of children and youth in Alberta is our highest priority. Budget 2022 provides $846.8 million for child intervention, which is an increase of $3.6 million. This increase will help grow and strengthen our kinship care programs and practice. Children's Services is increasing kinship and foster care supports by $3.3 million. This will include a focus on therapeutic foster care model and enhanced support for kinship caregivers, which we've spoken about in previous years. Children in care experience better outcomes when they're able to stay close to the people and the communities that they are familiar with, and that's why prioritizing placing children with extended families whenever possible so kids can continue to feel a sense of belonging and familiar support is our goal. 88% of children and youth served by child intervention are served in family-based care, meaning they receive services at home in kinship or foster care or permanency placements. Family-based care is important, and caregivers and caseworkers require specialized training to be successful. We're committed to providing increased training so every kinship caregiver who opens their home to a child has the knowledge and skills to provide excellent care. As always, Madam Chair, we're improving our policies and practices, especially to address the overrepresentation of Indigenous children in the child intervention system. Our commitment to reconciliation and our role in keeping Indigenous children rooted in their family, cultural, and spiritual traditions remains a top priority for Children's Services. We know that transitioning to adulthood can be especially challenging for young adults who are formerly in care. That's why I was pleased last week to announce our new Transition to Adulthood program so young adults can achieve independence while feeling supported at every step. The TAP program also includes vital financial supports, just like Advancing Futures. Advancing Futures is the one-of-its-kind program in Canada which provides social, emotional, and funding support so young adults who were in care can get help to attend post-secondary education, and I'm proud to continue our investment in that area. Madam Chair, it is always best to prevent a family crisis before it occurs. Over $63 million is being allocated to continue to help provide safety and support the well-being of families and communities to prevent the need for greater interventions and supports down the road. Family resource networks deliver programs that build parenting skills, improve child and youth development, and provide social supports for vulnerable families. Madam Chair, today 70 network hubs are coordinating and delivering services in every area of the province through 136 agencies with that budget of $63 million. Madam Chair, the dedicated and caring women and men at Children's Services are wholly committed to protecting and supporting Alberta's children, youth, and families. I do want to take this opportunity to thank the excellent staff here with me today and everyone in the ministry for their dedication to Alberta children. Many of our frontline staff, Madam Chair, are social workers, and as this is Social Work Week, I really do think it's fitting to thank them for the very, very important and often difficult work that they do. I also want to thank the child care operators and early childhood educators right across the province, as well as our nonprofit organizations that support families in need for all of the work that they do to support kids and families across Alberta as well. Budget 2022's focus on recovery and growth gives families good reason to be optimistic about the future of our province, Madam Chair. I am confident that this budget we've put forward will give us the resources we need, and I do ask for your support of the Children's Services budget. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Minister. For the next 60 minutes, members of the official opposition and the Minister may speak. Honourable members, you will be able to see the timer for the speaking block both in the committee room and on Microsoft Teams. Members, would you like to combine your time with the Minister?
I would like to, yes.
Minister? No. All right, so we'll go with block time, and please proceed.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are all gathered here today on Treaty 6 territory and to recognize the Métis people who share a deep connection with this land. I'd also acknowledge that it is International Women's Day, and so I'd like to congratulate all the strong, educated, smart women who are in this room right now, but to all women out there today, let's celebrate International Women's Day. We have a lot of work to do. And I'd also like to recognize Social Work Week and all of the many social workers who are professionals who dedicate their time to supporting children and families, particularly within children's services. And I'd like to thank all of the staff who are here today as well for joining us and bringing your expertise to this discussion today. I'd like to highlight for those who are listening, the decision by the Minister not to combine time today means that the Minister will have the opportunity to pick and choose which questions she will answer, and I really hope the Minister will be forthcoming and make her best efforts to answer all of the questions that are put forward before this committee. There are few opportunities for transparency and accountability under this current government, and this budget estimates is one of them. So I do have a number of questions for the Minister, and I hope she will be forthcoming in answering all of those. So I'd like to begin with the child intervention budget, and I'd like to note for the record that this has been a devastating year for children and youth in care. We've seen record high number of deaths of children and youth receiving child intervention services, 2.5 times higher than 10 years ago. And we also know that the Minister, co-chaired a child and youth well-being review panel, which highlighted the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on vulnerable, Indigenous, racialized, and low-income children and families. We've also seen a rise, of course, in opioid use, addiction, and homelessness in our province over the last period of time. So it is a particularly challenging time for vulnerable children and families. However, the child intervention budget that's been presented in Budget 2022 is essentially a flat budget. It is actually demonstrates no increased commitment of supports or resources for children and families. And in fact, if we were to look at the original budget that was tabled in 2021, it was $35.6 million higher than what we're seeing today. This is at a time when we acknowledge that children and youth are more at risk, and the government's own reviews and reports indicate that. So I want to note that for the record right now. I'd like to begin by discussing the Transition to Adulthood program. So line 4.2 of Budget 2022 indicates that the budget for youth in transition for last year, 2021, went up from $14.4 million to $51.2 million. So my guess is that that's because there has been funding that used to come out of another ministry's budget has now been allocated to children's services to reflect that increase. And I'd like to know whether or not it was moved from another line in the children's services budget, or was it moved from perhaps advanced education, because I'm making some assumptions here, and we're hoping for clarity as to whether or not the post-secondary tuition costs were previously, under the Advancing Futures, were previously paid out of the advanced budget, and now it's been moved here. But there's a big jump in the number for the budget that's reflected in 2021 and 2022. However, accounting for that change, if we look over the past 2 years, we actually see that the funding for youth in transition has decreased significantly. In fact, from 2 years ago, pre-pandemic, the budget was almost $10 million higher for youth in transition than it was presented in 2022. And it is also $3.3 million less than last year. So I would like the Minister to sort of explain why the change in budget numbers, and for a government that claims that they are supporting youth in transition, there's actually fewer supports being provided to children who are young people who are transitioning out of care. I also would like the minister to share with this committee how many young people in care does the ministry anticipate turning 18 in fiscal year 2022? How many are projected to turn 18 in 2023? How many young people transitioning out of care do they anticipate to turn 22 in 2022, meaning they'll no longer be eligible for financial supports? And how many are projected for 2023? The number of young people 18 years and over who are currently receiving the SAFA supports who have died since April 1st, 2021 is now at 20. This is double the number from 2 years ago. This age group has devastatingly seen the largest increase in deaths, which speaks to the particular vulnerability of this period of time, as we know the Office of the Child and Youth Advocate has spoken about many times, of this period of time of emerging adulthood and transitioning out of care. I would like the minister to explain why Budget 2022, line 4.2, actually allocates less money for this vulnerable group of people. Under the Transition to Adulthood program, line 4.2 of the budget, I'd like the minister to clarify that each of those young people between the ages of 18 up to 24 will continue to be provided a dedicated caseworker from Children's Services until the age of 24. I'd simply like some confirmation of what we've seen reported in the media. And then I would like to actually ask the minister to clarify the origins of this Transition to Adulthood program. For the committee's record, I would like to note that the decision to lower the age of eligibility on the SAFA program was first announced by this government in October 2019. These young people were told that at the age of 22, they would no longer receive a dedicated caseworker from Children's Services. In March 2021, the only reason that change did not come into effect was as a result of a court injunction issued as a result of a constitutional challenge from a young person who was losing supports under the SAFA program. A year later, in March 2021, the minister claimed that she would not be cutting those young people off these supports, including a dedicated caseworker during the pandemic. A mere 6 months later, that promise was broken, and the minister did move forward with cutting off young people from their dedicated caseworker at the age of 2022. And that was still during the pandemic, as this government will well recall. We still had the devastating 4th wave right after that, and then the 5th wave. So the minister broke that promise. Now we are a year later with Budget 2022 and the minister's comments, and we're hearing that the minister's now reversing course and is now going to continue to provide a dedicated caseworker to these young people transitioning out of care. And that is good news. That is good news because we know that emotional support is critically important. But the young people in this province who are transitioning out of care in the SAFA program, many of whom I've spoken to, many of whom I know the minister has spoken to, were absolutely devastated by this back and forth response by this government with respect to cutting off their dedicated caseworker over the last 2 years. And let's be clear, the decision here to reinstate a caseworker for these young people transitioning out of care really was the result of one brave young person who sought to challenge this government in court, and that it was a constitutional breach of their rights of security and safety of the person to cut them off from critical emotional supports as they transition into adulthood. So I'd like to give the minister an opportunity right now in this committee to apologize to those young people who she quite abruptly announced she would be cutting off supports 2 years ago.
Honourable member, could you please direct
Through the chair, I'd like to give the minister an opportunity to apologize to this committee and in this committee to young people who have been on this yo-yo of being told they would have supports, then they would not have supports, then it's only because of a brave young person who went forward and challenged us in court that they are now reinstating this dedicated caseworker support to these young people. And I'd like to have the minister, through the chair.
Point of order, Madam Chair.
Sorry, everyone, a point of order has been
I'd just
called.
like to know how this has to do with the budget estimates. I mean, she's asking for an apology when we're talking about budget estimates, and so I'm trying to understand, Madam Chair, how that has anything to do with budget estimates.
repeatedly referenced line 4.2, which is the youth and transition budget. I'm trying to understand whether or not a dedicated caseworker has been assigned. Under this, the minister herself in her opening comments referenced the transition to adulthood program. It's completely related to what's going on here. You had your chance, Mr. Hunter.
Madam Chair, I appreciate that she's referring to a line item, but once again, asking for the minister to apologize for something in estimates, I think would be completely out of order.
Thank you, member. You know, I don't see this as a point of order. I will allow the minister to address these if it's something that she has time to in her remarks. Please proceed.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Lastly, I'd like to ask the minister if the transition to adulthood program has been in the works for some period of time to continue to provide dedicated caseworker to youth transitioning out of care. Can the minister please explain why 2 FOIP requests indicate that between the periods of time of January 1st, 2021 and November 26, 2021, there was absolutely no communication between the Minister of Children's Services and her office with the Deputy Minister of Children's Services or with the Office of the Child and Youth Advocate related to the supports and financial assistance agreement programs. One would think that this should be a top priority given the number of deaths in care and the fact that there were discussions potentially to reinstate a dedicated caseworker. So I'd like the minister to comment on why there was no communication with her office, with her Deputy Minister or the Child and Youth Advocate. And lastly, if the minister can confirm for this committee that she continues to plan on publicly reporting on the deaths and serious injuries of young people receiving services up to the age of 24, even though financial supports are being cut off at 22. Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right, that concludes the, sorry, Minister, please proceed.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'm just getting down the last of the questions. I do intend to answer all of the questions that the member opposite has raised, Madam Chair. As I know, she had asked for that in her opening remarks, and I do want to assure her that I think that this process is an excellent opportunity for us to discuss the budget estimates and the business plan of the Ministry of Children's Services, and we will be responding to all of the questions she asked. So first, to start with child intervention, you know, I would say this has been, and I have said a number of times, this has been a difficult year. We have seen the, you know, additional deaths of children who have previously been in care or are in care, and that is of great concern to me. Not only is this a devastating tragedy, Madam Chair, but it is a call to action, and we committed to do something to make changes where they need to be made. And we do, in addition to all of the reviews that are currently outlined within our processes and our policies, I've asked for an additional review so that we can determine what's happening here and we can address any concerns that are raised throughout that process. When we look at the child intervention delivery budget, I can go through this you know, one item at a time. So what we see is that our Child Intervention Delivery Division provides support services to children and youth who are in need of intervention under CYFIA, which is the Child, Youth and Family Enhancement Act, because their safety is at risk or may be at risk in the care of their parent or guardian. Involvement may include services to children and youth at home or in care, guardianship, adoption, post-permanency services. The budget for child intervention delivery sees a slight reduction of 0.02% from 21 to 22, primarily related to some of the continuous enhancements and improvements to the delivery models and procurement of services. We talked about that last year. This is positive. This is actually a positive change in terms of how we procure support services like therapeutic foster care and some of the changes that we've been making in kinship. We do believe, as I know members opposite in this room have, or all members in this room have heard before, that children do better when they're connected to families and their culture and their communities. And that's why we've shifted our focus and our funding to support family-based and kinship care. So the child intervention delivery decrease is due to savings from changes to the ministry's procurement model and the new therapeutic foster care model. The budget in foster care and kinship care has increased to reflect this shift in delivery. This is, again, something that's very important to us, and I'm happy to be speaking about this today. Then when we move to the transition to adulthood program and line 4.2, When we saw the increase last year, I mean, that was an increase because we made a commitment to make sure that no young adult was transitioned off until they were ready. And so more than half of those young adults did successfully transition into adulthood, which is in fact the goal of the program, to make sure that there are supports in place for young people as they transition out of care. We know that transitioning to adulthood can be challenging for youth in care and young adults who have formerly been in care. And that's why, even in Budget 2019, we did speak about the need for a program that better addressed transitions of young people, not only for young people who might be moving between placements within child intervention, but also for young adults who are transitioning out of care and into adulthood. You know, oftentimes this was a financially based program in the past, the SAFA program. It was, you know, a young person would check in and they would sign an agreement for a financial support. And really, oftentimes what's needed for these young adults who are transitioning into adulthood is soft supports, you know, and somebody to check in on, make sure that they have natural supports in place, make sure that they have the skills and the things that they need to successfully transition and be successful in adulthood. So now instead of a program that really just focuses on, you know, here's a monthly funding amount, we have a program that now will also have caseworkers dedicated to this work. So whereas previously you may have a caseworker with a caseload of children of varying ages, including young adults, and now we will have caseworkers dedicated to this program specifically to say, do you need help accessing housing? Do you know how to apply for a lease? Do you need mental health supports and services? Can we help you connect? Can we help you connect to those support services that you might need? Help build natural supports in a child's life, open bank accounts. You know, if the young person is looking to get a job, do you have access to somebody who can help you write your resume and prep for interviews and apply for jobs? These transitions are difficult for any young person, but especially so for a young adult who maybe doesn't have all of those natural supports in place. So this is a shift that we have been talking about over the last 2 years. It's something that we have been working on, and I think that this is very, very positive in terms of the changes that this will have on young people. So how it will work is there's a couple of different pieces to this. And obviously Advancing Futures, we're maintaining that funding. And then there is this stream that will provide financial supports to young people up to 22, but then the soft supports will remain in place until 24. And this, I think, is just really important to help continue that transition. When it comes to the number of young people turning 18, typically there's an average of 550 young people who turn 18 every year. And about 150 turn 22 years old each year within that program. Looking at line 4.2 again, I believe I answered those questions, but no changes have been made other than the changes that were announced in Budget 2019. Obviously, last year there was an increased budget that we budgeted for to support young people who were continuing to transition out, as was our commitment during the pandemic. We wanted to make sure that kids were in fact ready to transition out of care. When it comes to continuing to report deaths of any young people who have formerly been in care up to the age of 24, that answer is yes for anyone receiving supports under the Supports and Financial Assistance programming. And I do believe that I have answered all of the members' questions.
Sorry, Honourable Member, please proceed.
Madam Chair, and thank you, Minister. So if I understand correctly then, in 4.2, Youth in Transition, the fact that this budget shows an increase even in budget 2021 from originally 14.4 million to 51.3 million. That is a result of new caseworkers being hired to provide that support to those youth who are transitioning under the Transition to Adulthood program. I'm still unclear as to why the budget line has changed significantly, and if that clarity can be provided, that'd be appreciated. The Budget 2022 reflects an increase, and the fiscal plan reflects an increase of approximately 99 new FTEs in children's services. Can the minister tell this committee how many new frontline child intervention positions this represents, how many in early intervention, as well as how many in the childcare area, if we can break down those new 99 FTEs. With respect to the frontline caseworkers and staff who work directly with children and families, what percentage of current frontline staff, both either in the ministry or within a contracted service agency, are registered social worker? Apart from those registered social workers, what is the educational background of the non-social worker frontline staff, and can she provide a breakdown as to what their educational background is? The ministerial panel on child intervention, which speaks to the entirety of line item 2 of the budget 2022, as that informs the work under that line item. There was a recommendation from that 2018 panel around recruitment and retention of child intervention staff in rural and remote areas. The ministry now notes that this is a completed task, and so can the minister table any assessments and analysis done by the department to determine that issues associated with staffing shortages and turnover in rural areas have been addressed, as it's noted as complete? Similarly, another ministerial panel on child intervention recommendation from 2018 that informs budget 2022 and the work under line item 2.0 of the budget recommends that the minister has indicated a recommendation that is noted as complete by the ministry is that the workforce, including frontline management and contracted services, reflect the population served. Since between 68 to 71% of the children and families in the child intervention system are Indigenous, can the minister report to this committee that 71% of the frontline child intervention workforce is Indigenous? If not, what percentage of the workforce self-identifies as Indigenous? With respect to line 2.4 of budget 2022, which refers to kinship and foster care support, how many Indigenous children are currently placed in kinship homes? I'm not asking for the number of kinship homes or the number of foster homes. I know that's reported on. I'm asking for how many Indigenous children currently receiving services are placed in kinship homes and how many are placed in foster homes, as well as how many who are placed in group care. In the business plan, performance measure 2B, the ministry has a target of 87% of children in family-based care, which actually collapses together foster care and kinship care. What is the ministry's target for the percentage of Indigenous children in kinship care, in foster care? And the same for Indigenous, non-Indigenous children. What is their goal? What is their target for each of those different types of care? Does budget 2022 and the increase in FTEs reflect that the ministry is planning on creating more positions within the ministry to supervise and support kinship homes? Or I'm trying to pick up on the minister's earlier comments, is it to support those young people who are in this transition to adulthood program? If it is to support more kinship care homes or either of those actually, will cuts be made to contracts with contracted service providers who currently perform that work? Essentially, are those positions coming in-house into the ministry? And one more thing on line 4.2 with respect to youth in transition. If it is in fact an increase in funding to reflect that there are dedicated caseworkers, I'm unclear as to how this is different from the way the Supports and Financial Assistance Agreement worked previously. My understanding is under the Supports and Financial Assistance Agreement, it wasn't just a financial supports. It was actually included the ongoing connection between that young person and their caseworker. So that caseworker continued to be assigned to that young person and work with them. So I'm not sure what is new here unless it's simply continuing what was happening before. As I know the minister is aware, many agencies supporting the work of the ministry in early and child intervention have seen significant staff shortages. In a survey conducted by Align, 68% of members saw staff turnover of 45 to 100% over the last 2 years. How much of what is set aside in Budget 2022 is dedicated to address this critical staffing challenge in agencies that care for children in care? How much more, as compared to last year, will the government be providing to these agencies to address this? As well, like with all Albertans, the cost of living is impacting agencies, foster homes, kinship homes, and group homes who are delegated responsibility to care for children who are the responsibility and are legally in the care of the government. Again, overall, the budget for child intervention, as the minister pointed out, is actually going down a slight bit. And while the minister says that that seems to be an achievement, you know, the rest of the child intervention budget is also flat. So where in this budget accounts for the rising cost of living and inflation on the services who are providing care directly to children that are the responsibility of government? How much more as compared to last year will the government be providing to support these agencies in these increased costs? We know that they have been facing the same challenges in terms of the cost of delivering their supports and services to children and families as all Albertans are experiencing, but these are children in the care and responsibility of the government. Under line item 2.4, the ministry is budgeting $231.7 million for kinship and foster care. Has the minister considered, under this budget line, using a portion of these funds for a one-time emergency payment to foster and kinship care families to assist with the drastic increase in cost of living and inflation? With respect to child advocacy centres, I was glad to see that the government followed through on the recommendation under the 2018 Ministerial Panel on Child Intervention to provide longer-term funding agreements, 3-year funding agreements to child advocacy centres. That ability to plan for their funding is critically important, and I'm glad the minister followed through on that recommendation. However, the current 3-year agreements that were entered into with child advocacy centres were done prior to the pandemic hitting. And sadly, we know that as a result of the pandemic, the isolation and the stress the pandemic has placed on families and children, children are more at risk. And while there was an initial drop in the number of cases of child abuse that were being reported, as these children are now being around more trusted adults like teachers and nurses and social workers once again, and coaches, we know that those numbers are going up significantly. And child advocacy centres across the province have seen a marked increase in the number of children that they are supporting, upwards of 20% at some advocacy centres. So I'd like to know what in Budget 2022 is being provided to child advocacy centres to actually support them with their increased caseload. And apart from the capital funding for the Central Alberta Child Advocacy Centre, which I know is a significant achievement, and that advocacy centre raised $19 million, and that this additional $3 million is very helpful for them. That is for the building, and I'm wondering how much is available within this budget to increase the operational funding for child advocacy centres. With respect to Bill C-92, there are currently 8 First Nations that have provided notice to exercise their legislative authority over child and family services or to enter into coordination agreements with Alberta and the federal government. To date, 1 letter of intent has been reached with Enoch First Nation, but some, like Louis Bull First Nation, gave notice more than 12 months ago, and no coordination agreement has been reached yet. Can the minister report to this committee that the province is working in good faith as partners with First Nations by indicating how much of Budget 2022 is dedicated to supporting First Nations and exercising their rights to care for their own children in their communities? And how many agreements does the province expect to conclude this fiscal year? And how many does it target to conclude in the next fiscal year? One recommendation that's currently from the Ministerial Panel on Child Intervention that's currently stated as in progress by the minister is that in the absence of federal funding for equity and child protection, Alberta will end the disparity with provincial funding. How does Budget 2022, which is flat, again it is flat in terms of funding for child intervention, reflect that your government is in the process of ending the disparity of funding on reserve? I'm aware that there was a federal government announcement that came out earlier this year about a settlement and potentially funds that will be going on reserve, but of course the details of that are still unclear. And in the meantime, children and families in these communities have waited for far too long with inequitable resources, and they deserve equity. So how long will this government wait for the federal government before stepping up to fulfill their commitment that they've said is currently in progress from the Ministerial Panel on Child Intervention? I see I'm about to run out of time, so I will leave it there and leave it for the minister to answer those questions, please. Thank you, Madam Chair.
So much, honourable member. Minister, please proceed.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. So first I'll answer the questions about number 4.2, youth in transition. So we did address things within this line item, like caseload increases, cost of tuition increases, as we know that those costs are covered through the Advancing Futures program. And so those case counts and costs are reflected in the ministry budget. And so that's really for both SAFAs and Advancing Futures. And you know, when it comes to that program and talking about it being financial supports, it really depended on the case, but primarily it was set up as a financial agreement. And in budget, I think it was 2019, when we first made these changes to the program, the data we had showed that young adults at the age of 22 started to drop off the agreements, that they didn't want to continue that relationship necessarily with children's services like they had in the past. That's why those changes were made. And so now we have a program that's not just a check-in, sign up for a monthly allowance. And in some cases, it was not all of those young people would be checking in with their caseworkers, you know, or really having that structured program and outcomes that needed to be met. Now, Madam Chair, we have a program that is really focused on outcomes. Yes, there is a monthly allowance, and that allowance is actually increasing by, I think, $25 or $28 a month. But it's also really about making sure that there is essentially a checklist for caseworkers to go through. The caseworkers are dedicated to youth transitions, so making sure that we're not waiting until 6 months before a young person is about to transition out of care to start that work, to make sure that right away there is a checklist in place to make sure that supports and services are in place for those young people. Then moving into the question of staff, the percentage of staff that are registered social workers is about 50%. Not all positions require a registered social worker. Other education, like university degrees, child and youth training, child and youth care counselors, and social workers are requirements for some of the jobs that we do post. We also, I would say, continue to look at recruiting and retaining rural staff, reporting that this recommendation is complete. We have to continue to recruit on an ongoing basis, as is the case with any ministry, but that's something that we continue to work on, and we continue to recruit all open positions within the ministry as well. The increase in FTEs is all related to childcare. We are reallocating frontline workers to meet demands of the system in child intervention and to support the transitions to adulthood and SAFA program. As I said before, what we previously saw was a mixed caseload for a caseworker where they may be supporting children between the ages of 0 and 18, as well as a couple of cases of young adults that are transitioning out of the system. Now we are creating a caseload that is dedicated, or a caseworker that is dedicated to a youth in transition caseload, whatever those programs are going to look like. And so this will definitely be more efficient and make sure that the caseworkers in those areas are dedicated to one area of focus. The 99 FTEs, mostly frontline, to support the child care agreement and the implementation of the early learning and child care agreement. Those are funded through federal dollars in the $3.8 billion Canada-Alberta Early Learning and Child Care Agreement. We need to support the increased capacity in the child care sector. These positions will provide direct support to parents, walking them through affordability subsidies, as well as supporting an increased number of licensed quality programs. We expect to create 10,000 new spaces in the next year, and so that does require staff to roll out that program and to make sure that those programs are in fact safe and high quality and following the legislation and regulations that we have in place to ensure parents of safe and high quality childcare. A small amount of those positions will be dedicated to policy development, research, data analysis, and IT support, but the vast majority will be focused on frontline supports. When it comes to working with partners in the communities, and certainly we've met with Align, both myself and the ministry meet with Align very regularly. We know workforce challenges are not just something that we're seeing in children's services, not something that we're just seeing in child intervention, not something that we're just seeing in childcare. We're seeing that in many fields across the province, and you know, I know this government obviously has a very clear mandate to support our workforce and the creation of jobs, and this is all part of that. We know that, you know, all employers are struggling again as we come out of this pandemic, and that's something that we continue to work with them on, and we're sustaining funding for them this year. When it comes to the most common placement types for Indigenous young people, about 32% are in foster care, 35% in kinship, and 30% would be a mix of group residential, or they are currently in their own homes receiving support services from the government. When it comes to how we fund Indigenous and non-Indigenous young people, we fund the same for all children off reserve. The Government of Canada does fund children on reserve, and I do think that the member opposite is aware of that. When it comes to the child advocacy centers, those were in fact 3-year funding agreements. And this was a commitment we made early on. This was something that the child advocacy centers, when we first announced that, said was a very positive thing, because previously it had been very ad hoc, and every year, much like our FRN partners, community organizations were waiting for the budget with bated breath to see if they were going to be funded, and now they have 3-year funding agreements. This is very positive. As we work through these 3 years, we also have asked them to come up with data. We need data and numbers and maybe more stringency within the formula to make sure that our funding levels are accurate, and that is something we're working through with all of the child advocacy centers. We meet with them on a regular basis. And I would point out that we're not the only ministry that funds the child advocacy centers as well. And so when we look at things through a children's services lens, we look at, you know, children obviously who are receiving or in need of prevention, early intervention services or child intervention services, but other ministries also fund CACs. And so that's something that also adds to the complexity of the funding model. So we are continuing to work through that. Obviously, we still have some time in that 3-year agreement, but we are reviewing those benefits so that we will be in a place to continue to fund them and make sure that we have transparency and make sure that the funding is really fair based on the caseloads that we're seeing and the number of children's services children who would be involved with children's services, if we have some way to measure that. But even common definitions of intakes and caseloads, that's not something that had previously been managed. The checks were cut, and sometimes it was just based on historical funding, but not necessarily any specific numbers. When we look at the ministerial panel, we continue to use all of those recommendations to inform policy and practice improvements within the ministry. We also are making sure that obviously, you know, that requires us working with First Nations and communities to make sure that children are being placed in homes that are with their families and with their cultures and in their communities. And so obviously that does require a lot of work with individual nations. We also continue to work on trilateral agreements under Bill C-92. This is a federal bill We have been asking the federal government where the funding is to come with their bill. That was one of the first asks that we made, and I know a number of Indigenous governing bodies that are looking to move forward under this legislation have made similar asks to the federal government. It's difficult for us to say how many we expect to sign because that's really up to the nations to put forward their wishes and move forward in that direction.
Thank you, Minister. That's the time allotted. Member, please proceed.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Minister. I would invite you, if there's an opportunity, to look back on the Hansard transcript of some of the questions, because I didn't get answers to all of my questions, and if those answers can be tabled before we consider estimates in the legislature, that would be appreciated. So I'm going to move on to childcare now. And I want to talk about line 3.0 in the budget, which states that the forecast for childcare in 2021 is $530.8 million. So that was for what we anticipate for the end of this fiscal year. So putting aside all of the federal funding, how much of that $530.8 million that's forecast for 2021 was provincial funding? I'm not looking for the amounts for the bilateral, the one-time workforce funding, the Canada-Alberta ELCC funding. I'm specifically asking about what portion of the forecast of 2021 was provincial. And I believe the minister may have addressed this in her opening comments, but line 3 in budget 2022, how much of that is provincial? I want to confirm that of that $1.07 billion, $350 million, or roughly about 30% of that funding for that budget is actual provincial funding. Page 133 of the government's fiscal plan talks about the $56 million. Well, actually, it sets out the funding that was received and is anticipated for the year ahead. Where is the $56 million, the one-time workforce funding, reflected in this budget? Which line item does it come from? Did that actually reduce provincial funding in that line item? I believe the minister may have referenced that it came from the Childcare Quality and Worker Supports line 3.2 of the budget. And if that's the case, it means that that line item would have actually received $168.5 million in 2021, but only $140.6 million appears to be forecast to be spent. So I'd like to know what the remaining amount and where that is being allocated. With respect to the Canada-Alberta ELCC funding agreement, first I'd like to ask if the minister can address in this committee whether or not that agreement, and specifically Alberta's action plan, which I understand is supplementary to that agreement through the chair, can the minister table that or make that publicly available, the actual wording of the agreement and the action plan with the federal government? Fiscal plan, page 133, indicates $666 million in 2022 is coming to the government through this Canada-Alberta ELCC agreement. Can the minister tell the committee what is the breakdown, specific breakdown of that $666 million in federal funding in terms of what portion of that and how much of that is going to affordability, how much of it is going to accessibility, which I interpret to mean both space creation as well as Indigenous-led childcare, inclusive childcare, what portion of that is going to workforce development, and what portion of that is going to administration. If that can be broken down for 2022, 2023, and 2024. Of the workforce funding that is allocated for 2022 in this budget, can the minister advise this committee how much is budgeted to increase wages and implement a wage grid in this fiscal year? I'm not asking about professional development and training or how much is budgeted in line 3.2 for that, but how much of what is allocated in line 3.2, apart from the provincial funding for wage top-ups, is actually allocated to increase the wage top-up or to implement a wage grid? Of the accessibility funding from the Canada ELCC agreement, and the minister has noted, of course, that in the business plan there's a goal of creating 10,000 new nonprofit childcare spaces this year. How will that funding be used to support nonprofits and municipalities to actually create spaces? For example, other provinces are providing grants to nonprofits to renovate existing spaces or to create new spaces. Can the minister provide details to this committee about how that funding will be used to actually actively work and engage with nonprofits to create new spaces? How much Can the minister advise how much in resources have been set aside in this budget for engagement and consultation with the sector, including educators, for this fiscal year? And will the minister release publicly who the minister is consulting with and which stakeholders she is speaking to in developing the plan for implementation for this funding agreement? I believe the minister already answered the question of how many new FTEs in childcare were there to transition to new federal funding. It sounds like all 99 of the new FTEs for the ministry for this year. With respect to space creation, overall, we understand that this Canada ELCC agreement will create 42,500 new spaces over the time period of the agreement. Can the minister clarify for this committee, is that 42,500 new spaces from the day the agreement was signed, as in November 15th, 2021, or what is the starting benchmark as to when those new spaces will be created? With respect to line 2 of budget 2022, at the end of fiscal year 2020, the ministry issued the Child Care Capacity Building Grant, which gave out 44 grants for $10.3 million to create 1,600 new childcare spaces in 2021. The funds were supposed to be used by the end of this fiscal year. How many of those new 1,600 spaces are now licensed? Not just created, but actually licensed out of those 1,600 spaces? And how many of them are actually enrolled out of the 1,600 spaces? I understand one unlicensed childcare provider in Fort McMurray received $417,000 under this child care capacity building grant, but to date, almost a year later, still is not licensed and still has not created a facility or opened new spaces. So how many other unlicensed organizations have received public funds under this grant but have not actually created licensed spaces that have opened for Albertans to use? With respect to overnight care, the Child Care Capacity Building Grant was supposed to create 182 new overnight spaces. Can the minister report to this committee how many of those 182 spaces were enrolled and are actually operational, that they're actually being used right now? In total, can the minister report to this committee how many licensed overnight spaces there are in the province, currently in the province, and how many of those licensed overnight spaces are actually enrolled? With respect to the goal of licensed space creation, can the minister table for this committee or report to this committee by 2025-2026, how many licensed spaces does the minister project Alberta to have in total? And what are the projections that the ministry is using in terms of how many children aged 0 to 5 there will be in Alberta in 2025-26? The business plan for the ministry indicates that the total licensed spaces as of March of last year were roughly 143,469, I believe. How many of these spaces, how many licensed spaces are there currently as of the end of February 2022? What is the most updated number of the licensed spaces in Alberta? As well as what is the most recent number of the number of spaces that are actually enrolled? With respect to early childhood educators, how many early childhood educators are currently receiving wage top-up at level 1, level 2, and level 3? I want to be very clear, I'm not asking for how many educators are actually certified by the ministry, because that does not actually reflect how many of those educators are actually working. I'm looking for, the ministry should obviously have the number that are actually working based on wage top-up claims. So how many of those, how many educators do we have at each of those levels who are actually receiving wage top-up? And how many of those educators are currently working in preschool? In 2021, there were 143,469 licensed spaces. So using a conservative ratio of about 1 to 6 educators to children, Alberta should need approximately 24,000 educators to staff those existing spaces, and yet Alberta only currently has approximately 15,000 educators by the end of the 2020 fiscal year. So we already have a shortfall in this province of roughly 9,000 early childhood educators. If the ministry expects to create 42,500 new spaces requiring approximately another 7,000 educators, how does the ministry expect to attract and retain another 16,000 educators between now and then without any changes to the wage grid or top-ups for educators? With respect to out-of-school care, how many children are currently enrolled in out-of-school care programs in Alberta? Currently, all of these families using out-of-school care do not have access to anywhere near the same support as other families using childcare, meaning some parents using out-of-school care will pay twice as much for 1 to 2 hours of before and after school care as a family who's using full-time childcare. These parents also need help with their fees. I'm aware that the federal funding under the ELCC agreement is limited to preschool-aged children. However, I'm asking the minister to report to this committee as to how much in budget 2022 of provincial funding is being allocated to expand affordability grants to the thousands of Alberta families using out-of-school care. How many educators are currently working in out-of-school care and at what certification levels? Again, I'm not looking for the number who are certified, but the number who are actually claiming wage top-ups. And I will end there, given my time is running out.
Thank you, Honourable Member, and now over to the Minister.
Well, thank you very much. Obviously, I will take any opportunity to talk about the Made in Alberta plan and the agreement that we signed with the federal government to bring $3.8 billion of Albertans' hard-earned tax dollars back to Alberta to support working parents so that they can take part in our economic recovery. We are seeing jobs created in this province every single day. 130,000 jobs created last year alone. Parents want to be part of that recovery. I would say that's a major shift from the jobs lost under the former government due to bad policies, job-killing policies. I think what we're seeing is a pro-growth, free market focus on the economy is creating jobs, and that's positive, and we want parents to be able to take part in that. And so we are proud of the agreement that we signed with the federal government. And, just to be very clear, $3.8 billion, that's $1 billion in funding for this budget year alone. That is something to celebrate. Those investments in parents absolutely matter. And so, I'm happy to break down kind of what that looks like in this year. So there is about, as I stated in my opening remarks, $350 million in provincial funding. That remains the same. We've said the whole time that, federal funding is not going to replace provincial funding, that we will maintain our investments in this area, and that's exactly what we've done through this commitment, and that's a requirement, obviously, of the agreement with the federal government when it comes to childcare. So in this year alone, I can walk through the $666 million of federal investments. We've essentially got in 3.1, 531 million that is dedicated, 531.5 million dedicated to affordability. Our goal really was to support parents first. Every province has a different approach to how they're going to roll these dollars out over the 5 years. And our approach really was to look at, when we have the second highest wage top-ups in the whole country, when it comes to level 3 early childhood educators, our priority was really about supporting parents because we saw enrollment go down. Obviously, throughout the pandemic, there was economic uncertainty. There was uncertainty when it came to the pandemic. And, our thought was really to support parents so that they have the choice to find affordable, accessible, high-quality childcare in their communities. And so we are seeing enrollment go back up. We're not quite at pre-pandemic levels just yet, but that's a positive. And then when we look at, we've got $50 million for accessibility. We have additional $84.6 million that is dedicated, and I know the member wants very specific numbers on each line item, but that supports wage top-ups, professional development, curriculum enhancements that we committed to as well under this agreement, and the child care supports. So that is part of the work that we're doing to consult. And, I know formerly, I think the member opposite would know when she had asked Madam Chair for, some of the names of the people who had been part of the working parents group, there was really just a fear, quite frankly, of the fear and division and misinformation being shared by the member opposite. They were fearful to have their names published. They didn't want to be ostracized. They didn't want to be bullied by the members. And so I did maintain my commitment to consult with that small group. But now we've been meeting with dozens dozens of childcare operators already, but there is a fulsome plan to continue to consult with operators and educators throughout the coming months. Because we want to make sure we get this right. We want to make sure that the investments are exactly where they need to be. And so, you know, when we talk about a wage grid, our wage grid in the agreement and the agreements, I know the member opposite is asking me to table those. That's not up to me to table. That's up to the federal government. They have said that they will be posting those agreements. And so we'll continue to watch for that. But our grid is based on essentially our current wages, including the wage top-ups, and that's a base rate to start. But again, 70% of operators pay over and above those base rates, which I think, again, is positive. And operators are in the best position to make those decisions about their workforce. So we will continue to work on that, but there absolutely is funding in this agreement dedicated to that, and that will be rolling out, you know, again, once we consult in this budget year. When we look at the accessibility dollars and how we're actually going to get to creating 10,000 home-based and nonprofit childcare spaces in this year, how will we actually do that? That work again has begun. You know, even last year, RMA, AUMA, then meeting with municipalities who we know were areas that were underserved in terms of childcare spaces, but also areas that were interested in creating spaces. We know that this is a lofty goal. It definitely is a lofty goal, and it's going to require flexibility. And yes, it will require funding just like it did in the previous expressions of interest. The process will likely be a little bit different, but we know that we will have to provide some of our nonprofit partners and municipal partners with seed grants. We're changing the application process to make it a little bit more simple because, you know, last year we did have 1,500 spaces that we were going to fund the creation of within our affordability grants, but we really want to make it very easy and be really creative in terms of how we approach that, recognizing that every community in this province is different and may approach this in a unique way. So we are creating creative partnerships. One of the major barriers that we have found, and it's something that we actually have a number of meetings on this week and next, is around the overnight care. It's actually, there's a number of communities where municipal bylaws are preventing some of that, some of those spaces from getting up and running. We are, when we talk about red tape, that's exactly what we're talking about, is a municipal bylaw preventing something that should be enabled by an operator and a provincial government investment to create those spaces. Of the 1,500 spaces that we invested in last year, over 1,000 of them are already licensed. We have 97 new overnight spaces that are operating. When we look at out-of-school care enrollment, we have 51,684 spaces. 32,353 of those are enrolled. The federal government, and we asked if we could include out-of-school care in this agreement, and you know, really the federal government's program is designed at supporting those 0 to 5 because that's where the cost of childcare is quite high and can be a barrier for parents who are wanting to access training or workforce opportunities. When it comes to the educators, I would say this. I mean, we're seeing our levels of educators in the field go up. I know the member opposite has some interesting data that she's been using in question period in the House, but it doesn't really match what we're seeing within our ministry numbers. So it's actually quite positive that while we did dip in March of 2021, our numbers now, March of 2020, in terms of staff, we had 18,818, and we are right back up now to 18,558. I mean, that's up 500 educators since last month, which is very positive, working and enrolled in the system. This is very positive. And so I think obviously a lot of that is enrollment is growing. I think that's also part of this agreement that we have with the federal government. As we see enrollment grow, we see educators come back into the workforce. That's exactly what we had hoped to see, and it's exactly what we're seeing. So I think that that's very positive to see that happening. When it comes to the levels that educators are, how many we have in each program type, it is looking like as of December, I have the numbers as of December, so it reflects the just over 18,000 workers, not the 18,500 that we see now. But 7,100, almost 7,200 are level 1, almost 3,000 are level 2, and nearly 8,000, 7,921 are level 3s. And so we also do, through this agreement with the federal government, have goals to upskill and move educators throughout that grid from level 1 to level 2. And that's why I know the member opposite wants to talk only about wage top-ups, but professional development is also very important because we want to make sure that we have the opportunity for educators to increase their training and then, of course, increase their salary through that wage grid, which I think is a positive for both kids and educators.
Thank you, Minister, and that's our time. I do see that member...
Sorry, there's 1 minute left.
1 minute left. That goes to member. Please proceed.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I will note that the minister continually refers to the Alberta educators receiving the second highest wage top-up, but they're still the third lowest paid in the country. And with respect to there's a number of questions that the minister did not get a chance to answer, so I'm hoping that through the chair, I'm hoping that the minister will get a chance to go back and reflect on a number of the questions. And if the minister is unclear, she can check the Atkinson report from 2020 to check the early childhood educator wages and how it compares across the country. There's a number of questions there. I'd like to know that I'd like to encourage the minister to go back and actually listen to all the questions I asked, because a number of those questions were not answered. So I hope the minister will have an opportunity to do that and to table that in writing with this committee. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, everyone. And I see that Member Gottfried has joined us remotely here. Member, would you like to introduce yourself? And we seem to have some connectivity issues, so I will proceed with concluding the first portion of questions from the official opposition. We'll now move to our independent side here for 20 minutes of questions. Would you like to combine your time with the minister?
I prefer to go back and forth.
Minister? Sure. All right, please proceed.
Okay, thank you very much, Minister. Appreciate that. I'm going to go, I'll leave some of the other questions till later, but the questions I'm going at now, I think it'd be good to have the answers, and then it may negate some questions I have to ask later on. So we'll start with the revenue line on federal transfers, which of course I believe is from the $10 per day daycare program. So I'm obviously supportive of a means-tested daycare program that provides support for low-income parents to rejoin the workforce when and where they want to or need to. And I've right now I have 5 grandchildren in some form of daycare right now, and of course my wife and my mother-in-law both spent much of their lives in daycare and early childhood education. So I do appreciate the value of daycare, and I know my children use daycares and appreciate that. So what I'm wondering is, I guess a lot of it has to do with the income and what where this $10 a day daycare kicks in. So obviously we could have and sorry to use this, but we could have a cabinet minister making $180,000 a year. We could have an MLA making $120,000 a year. We could have a project manager making $90,000 a year. Do they all qualify for the $10 a day daycare?
That's a good question. So just to give some background, Madam Chair, to the member for that question and kind of where this agreement came from, there were things that we in Alberta, obviously we were not the first to sign, and I said often, you've all heard me say it, a million times, that we had to fight for a Made in Alberta plan. The federal government's agreement was essentially to reduce fees for all parents. They wanted to look at quote unquote universal. What we saw during the NDP pilot is parents who would have access to $10 a day weren't always necessarily the parents who needed those spaces. And so as the dollars roll out year over year, and there's more money each and every year, so this year being the $666 million, you can roll that out in a variety of ways. A lot of other provinces are saying, look, we're going to pick some who are going to be in, and we're going to pick some who are going to be out. We see that out of information. Certainly there's been a couple of other provinces that have said we're leaving out private operators, which is what the NDP did. That was something we did not want to do. So there has to be another way to make sure, because there isn't enough money to truly do it universally for every single child in the province. We don't see every single child in the province registered in a preschool or a childcare program. So we did two things, I think, essentially, that really targeted these dollars in a way that other provinces have not. And I will say I am appreciative of the federal government's flexibility, because means testing is not necessarily something that I think was a focus of the federal government at all. But there, I think we made a good case that you have to target the money. Especially in the first few years, because there's just not enough to do it. And the NDP pilot was so wildly disruptive to communities, where then you had, childcare centers that have been open for 35 years, not registered, parents who were lower income couldn't get into the spaces. I had people write in, we've got doctors in our spaces and we have kids in need that need the space. And so we just said, look, we'll focus on reducing fees for all parents by half, an average of half. So our childcare fees in Alberta, the average is, somewhere over $1,000 a month when we take every single space in the province, average that out. So the operating grants, it's easier to go that way first. So first of all, there's an operating grant. So say, I'm going to use an example of a toddler-aged child, 19 months to under 3 years. That childcare would, in a center, would receive an operating grant of $510. So that would reduce essentially the fees on average by half for every single parent, regardless of how much they make, because that was a requirement of the federal government. Then in addition to that, the family making up to $180,000 a year, and I think really there the number was based on how do we support low and middle income families, but really just be inclusive and use the dollars as best we can. And we know that will likely change. These numbers will likely change as more federal dollars roll out. But just to give you an example, so say a family with an annual combined income of $120,000, they have two toddlers in that 19 month to 3 years old range, and they're enrolled full-time in a licensed daycare. So in December, their fees would have been, at the average of $1,100 a month, $2,200 a month. Now, in January, once these affordability dollars and the new subsidy program rolled out, the family would benefit from the $510 affordability grant per child, and then they would also qualify for an additional subsidy of $253 per child. So that combined savings of $763 a child means that their fees would go from $1,100 a child to $337. So for two children, their fees have now gone from $2,200 a month to $674 a month. So that's just one example, but it's, I guess, easiest to look at the operating grant reducing the fees and then that subsidy coming in later. But one of the tenets of one of the things that the federal government required was that they want to see every single space go to $10 a day. We fought for flexibility to target to those who need it most in the first year, but recognizing that with each year of the action plan, every province is going to do different things as we roll those dollars out. And again, this is on average. When we look at the average rates of childcare across the province, but our focus was not to leave anybody out. And I would say too, having been to your community and met lots of your constituents, I think, we hear a lot about parent choice, part-time care being very important for parents who might be working from home or working from part-time, or stay-at-home parents who want just high quality programming for their young kids, right? Social and emotional development. This is positive. We included preschools, which was also a group that the former government left out completely. I hope that answers kind of your question in terms of the genesis, what that looks like this year, and how it's going to change over time.
Okay, yeah, so I think that's helpful, but, and just to be clear, obviously, then every parent, no matter what, how much income, or every family, no matter how much income, gets some benefit from this. Now, is there a chart that you could provide us, and obviously this is maybe something to undertake, that we could have like in $10,000 increments, what, parents would pay for, and it wouldn't matter if we picked one child or two children or whatever, just so there was some sort of formula that we could see, that people could look at and relate to.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's all currently available online. I think it is under alberta.ca/childcare deal. But it does break down how much what the operating grants are for each type of childcare, whether that's a center or a home-based, whether that's part-time, overnight, or full-time, and then as well what the subsidy charts look like. Yep.
So, and so just for instance, maybe a single mother making $20,000 a year, how does that compare to the previous means-tested system, the cost that would be incurred by, under the new program versus the old program?
So the goal of the federal government, again, is to get every single family to an average of $10 a day per child in all licensed spaces over the next 5 years. And again, means testing was something that we definitely pushed for. It's something that is not included in many other provinces' plans across the country. It's not an apples to apples comparison of what that subsidy looked like before, because now we have the operating grants in place. There was a lot of misinformation being shared about, people paying more when they're low income. That is not true. Every family would see a reduction in their childcare fees. However, for many lower income families that were already on full subsidy, they were already paying in many cases less than $13 a day. And it was an average of $13 a day. So many families were actually already paying less than $10 a day. They're still seeing a reduction. It may not be as big as the reduction in all of the spaces, but again, that is partially because of the federal government's requirement to reduce those fees for every single family by half. And I think, obviously there are also, it's important to note that we have programs specifically in Calgary and Edmonton through partners like Catholic Family Services and Terra Center, where, for example, pregnant and parenting teens have access to free childcare because we know that they need to finish high school. And so those are things that we're going to look at as we look at creating new spaces as well. That's an important group where they will pay nothing. And so I think it's important to highlight those support services.
Okay, so is it fair to say that the ones that were the real low-income parents that were paying nothing in the previous program will still be paying nothing at the new program?
It's not an apples to apples comparison because of the way that the subsidies work. So parents will still pay, on average, parents who would be having received full subsidy before would still be paying an average of less than $10 a day already under this program.
Because I believe some of the parents, the low-income parents in the past program were paying zero for daycare if they were in that, maybe that $20,000 range, paying zero for daycare. Now, I guess maybe will that depend on how much the daycare is charging?
It does.
Okay.
Yes, because the operating grants are general, right? They are
based on an average.
They're based on the average, and so different spaces would obviously have a different fee. And again, it's kind of the balance between the federal government's requirement to making sure that we have reductions for every single family, and then our approach to make sure that parents still have choice, and that there is flexibility for different communities to approach things differently, for operators to still remain open. Private operators were completely left out under the former government. We had to also find a way to make sure that these often female entrepreneurs could continue to keep their doors open and not have to transition into a nonprofit, which is exactly what they were planning under the NDP's pilot program. They said there was absolutely no way for them to operate, many of them told us this, as a private operator under that structure, given all of the constraints that were in place. So, this is overall a very, very positive program. And again, we wanted to make sure that we were driving essentially workforce participation, right? Or access for post-secondary. And so as we continue to roll this out, these are exactly the types of things that we need to look at too, in supporting parents and families as we continue to reduce fees over the next 5 years.
Yeah, okay, so I guess then it would, I think it would be fair to say then that somebody was paying nothing before because they had a lower cost of daycare, that with the new program, they would probably still have them paying nothing, I'm guessing.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Okay, no, that's fair then, okay, perfect. And I guess another question here, maybe on a slightly different vein, but when a parent is staying home and giving up their potential to earn more money for the household, is there any tax rebates for that decision?
So there's two things. Those parents who are choosing to stay home would still benefit from the overall reduction in fees, right? That operating grant that is reducing their fees. If they choose childcare, full-time or part-time, they would still see a reduction in childcare costs. Also, there is, again, preschool. They're receiving operating grants which lower the cost for preschool. And then additional subsidy for parents who may need it. There is also a tax credit program. We did ask for, I mean, one of the things that we started at when we were asking the federal government in negotiations, we asked for flexibility to support all parents. And obviously, I think we all know the focus of the federal government's plan. And, you know, they made it very clear, and I'm certainly not here to speak for the Trudeau government, but they have pointed out a variety of times that the Canada Child Benefit was increased in the federal budget at the same time that they rolled out this plan, so they weren't interested in necessarily a tax credit program at the provincial level. We also have the Alberta Family and Child Benefit, which supports lower income families and middle income families with children under 18, and that's a direct financial benefit to those families. There's 335,000 in the Alberta Child and Family Benefit $335 million identified for the Alberta Child and Family Benefit, and so that's a direct benefit that goes to all low income and middle income families, based on a specific formula, regardless of the choices that they make as well. Additionally, I would say for parents who are accessing unlicensed childcare, or maybe a family member is looking after their children, there are also tax deductions available at the federal level as well to reduce, or I guess to reflect those costs.
And I guess maybe that's more where I was headed with that one, was parents that stay, you know, a parent stays home and then doesn't utilize daycare at all. Is there any tax benefits or rebates for those folks that actually don't use the daycare,
Yeah.
that parents chooses to stay home with the children?
Yeah, and so again, that's, you know, for low and middle income families, there is the Alberta Family and Child Benefit, but then at the federal level, there were increases, and again, I can't speak to their budgets, but they did say that they, you know, they committed to increase the Canada Child Benefit, which is means tested, and that's at the federal level. So there are programs in place for those parents as well.
Okay, thank you. Moving on, I guess, just a little bit. I guess I'll go to some questions, maybe just more on the financial end of things. On page 17, under revenue, there's a line item called Other Federal Transfers. Is that the federal daycare program? I think it went from 83 million to 822 million. Is that increased due to the federal transfers from?
Okay, so when we look at other federal transfers, this includes the Child Special Allowance and revenue for the Canada Alberta Early Learning and Child Care Agreement. The Child Special Allowance is a tax-free monthly payment to help with the care and education of children who are under the age of 18, who physically reside in Canada and who are being supported by the province, where the province is the legal guardian. So, for example, in child intervention, the CSA is paid to the province for providing care to the child. the current amount payable also includes a supplement to the CSA, which is the Children's Disability Benefit, which is really intended to help with the cost of caring for children with disabilities under the age of 18 as well. And then obviously the Canada Alberta Early Learning and Childcare Agreement, which we did sign, again, $3.8 billion over 5 years to build and support the childcare programs here in Alberta.
And that's going to other revenue, and there was a decrease from, and that's again on page 17. It's included in other revenue. It decreased by 20 million between actual 2021 and estimated 22-23. I think it went from 31 million, and the estimate is for 7 million. So what was that decrease of over $20 million? Yes, that's on page 17, revenue, and the line item is other revenue.
We're just looking to get that information
No
for
problem.
you here.
I just wasn't sure if I described it good enough.
That one, if the
Sure.
member would like, just so that we can not eat up your time.
Okay, no problem. Also on page 17, under revenue, there's premiums, fees, and licensing. And I just wondered what's included in the premiums, fees, and licensing?
So that is costs that are charged for applications and licenses representing revenue from licensing of childcare facilities. So there are no premiums or fees collected in children's services, but it is a licensing cost. It is $200 for the initial application for a childcare to apply for licensing, and then $100 for the renewal cost. The initial application is valid for 1 year, and then renewals are good for 3 years.
Okay, thank you. Also under page 17, under expenses, the Alberta Child Benefit, it appears to end, and is the Alberta Child and Family Benefit, is that the replacement of that?
Yes, so that change was made, I can't remember if it was budget 2019 or 2020, but those programs were brought together into one.
Okay, thanks. And then again, under expenses on page 17, why did the Alberta Child and Family Benefit increase so much compared to actual 2021 figures? I think it went from 219 million to 335 million in estimates.
Yeah,
Thank you so much, members. So it concludes. This time now goes over to the UCP caucus. So that concludes the first portion of questions for independent members. So I will just mention now that we will take the break after the UCP rotation. So that'll be at 10:55, as the other meeting is breaking after the independent rotation. That means we'll get fresh coffee. Okay, so now we'll move to the government caucus for 20 minutes of questions from the members. Would you like to combine your time with the minister?
Madam Chair, I would like to provide my time. Minister so willing. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Minister, for being here today. I just wanted to start off on the high points. I think this budget it's obviously a historic budget for Alberta with a balanced budget. But also, I think what's really significant here is that we're seeing a 39% increase in funding, which is something that can only be accomplished through strict fiscal discipline, which I have to applaud you for, Minister, because I know that as a little bit of a fiscal hawk yourself, you've probably made some big changes and have made this work. So I just want to say thank you for your work in getting us to balance, and also for being able to have flexibility in your budget to support the families that need it the most. So you've said in your opening comments that this budget, as well as the Children's Services budget, respects parent choice and respects private operators and their ability to continue to operate. So I would like to give you an opportunity, because, Minister, I know you fought very hard for an Alberta-made childcare program that supports as many families as possible, regardless of their choice and provider. And I just want to say congratulations again. I know I've said that to you about 1 million times, but congratulations again for getting this important work done. I know, as somebody who hopes to bring children into the world, that this is this is a huge deal for Alberta families. So I also understand that Alberta is one of only a small number of provinces and territories to even begin implementing this program to start supporting families. So outcome 1 of your business plan relates to ensuring Albertans have access to early childhood education and childcare options and our participation in training, education, and workforce. So, Minister, how does this agreement relate to outcome 1, and what should Albertans know about the agreement?
That's a great question. This agreement will support programs, of course, to meet the unique needs of Albertans through what we've been calling a historic $3.8 billion agreement over 5 years with the federal government. And it's true, we've talked a lot about the delay in Alberta signing the agreement. That was not for lack of trying, and we were the last province to receive our term sheet. We then had a federal election in the middle of our negotiations. These are things that are well outside our control, but we worked really hard with community partners. We had the Supporting Working Parents advisory group that really worked hard on a plausible plan. The minute that the election was done, we were reaching out with that plan and, support of our community partners, which I think we couldn't have done this without the childcare operators that took the time to give us feedback. That was really important, and I think it showed that this wasn't about politics. This was about really reflecting and respecting the choices that Alberta parents are making when it comes to childcare, and not leaving anybody out, because we saw how disruptive that was, as the member opposite knows, in the former government's pilot program. And so this agreement is focused on children age 0 to kindergarten age. Again, kindergarten is something that we also push for flexibility on, as the federal government really wanted to support on 0 to 5, or focus on kids age 0 to 5. And, again, Alberta is unique when it comes to kindergarten, and we wanted to make sure that we had flexibility to support those kids too. The goal is obviously to reduce childcare fees on average by half based on those average numbers in this year. Those dollars, as the member pointed out, I guess I would like to say we're a tie for first in terms of rolling out affordability dollars for parents. And that's for a few reasons. I mean, when we look at the number of spaces that we have and the enrollment numbers we have, we've typically been around 80% enrollment. That's because in years where parents were working and the economy was really good, we had private operators step up, again, often female entrepreneurs, to say, hey, there's a need in my community and I'm going to support my neighbors and I'm going to open up this childcare center to help them. We did not want to go down the path that other provinces have, or that, quite frankly, in the pilot program we had for $25 a day childcare here, left out those operators. That just clearly wasn't something that we were interested in, because that's well over 60% of our providers in our spaces. So, we made sure to include that, and preschools, again, supporting parent choice. We obviously have a curriculum framework, it's flight, it's excellent, but we also know parents want choice in terms of the type of programming they offer, and those were changes that we made in our legislation that are reflected in the agreement that we made with the federal government. So we also know that high quality care starts with high quality educators. We negotiated funds for PD and training, as well as wage enhancements for educators in this as well, but also making sure that we're investing in inclusive programming, cultural resources, and more spaces, specifically focusing on areas of the province that really truly need spaces. So probably right now, our focus, not necessarily where we're all sitting today, there's lots of childcare here in our community where we're located in downtown Edmonton, but we need to look at some of the rural communities that are underserved, or where areas where enrollment is a little bit higher. And so we are really proud that that's included in this plan.
Thank you for the fulsome answer, Minister. I'm curious, though. I don't doubt your commitment to the program. I see that you are extremely committed and that you've worked very hard for a Made in Alberta plan. But I am curious, because I have heard some concerns from constituents about the rollout raised by providers and parents. So what are you doing in Budget 2020 to alleviate these concerns by my constituents?
That's a good question, and I know, the rollout of this was important. I would say this. First of all, I need to thank childcare operators for their flexibility, because anytime you're changing a program or the way something works, we know it creates uncertainty, for lack of a better word, for all of those who are included, and that includes childcare operators. We value the insight and expertise of operators. We consulted with our legislative changes, the first broad consultation of this sector in more than a decade. And we also need to listen to parents who are the users of this system. And so our focus really was on, first of all, supporting parents. Who are we here to serve? Alberta, the people of Alberta who want to get back to work or go back to school and take advantage of the opportunities that we have in Alberta. That was our first priority, was to roll out the affordability dollars. But there are a number of other areas of the agreement that require a little bit of feedback, specifically areas where we might have heard a variety of feedback or differing opinions, things that we may have heard different things in different parts of the province. And those things are, first of all, how do we refine affordability grants for hours in unique circumstances? That's something we've heard. Things like overnight care or care for less than 50 hours a month. We will definitely work at that. Our first focus, obviously, part-time, full-time care, but that's something that we need to look at. Creating spaces, what does that rollout look like in terms of the space creation dollars, and how we work with nonprofits, with day home agencies, with other agencies within the province that support children and families. Are there ways that we can think a little bit differently about how we've rolled those things out in the past, and just be really flexible, knowing that every community is going to be a little bit different, and we, in many cases, we need to get rid of red tape to make sure we can bring those operators into the system, like things like overnight care. We know that we need to support our early childhood educator workforce. That's something that we've heard a lot of. The feedback on that, again, it hasn't just been, I know the opposition likes to talk more money just solves all the problems. And, I think when we're looking at $1 billion investment in childcare this year, that's exceptional news. There are dollars in this agreement to support both wages and professional development, but we need to look at also how we're moving educators up throughout those levels, making sure we're supporting their education, making sure that it doesn't just happen in Calgary and Edmonton, making sure that rural communities have different ways to access that training too. Or we've heard a lot of feedback for parents who are, parents who are also educators saying, I work full time and I need online programs. I need better distance programs. I need some creative ways that I can access this training. And so we're working with community organizations and post-secondary institutions on that, and really modernizing that funding approach so that we can get rid of some of that red tape, and again, be flexible, because we know that 10,000 spaces this year is ambitious. I'll say ambitious, but that's a good problem to have, and we're absolutely dedicated to it. So if anybody wants to be included in some of those roundtables, we'll be doing roundtables and meetings with educators. We've had lots that have reached out to my office, and we keep a list of those just because we need to hear that feedback. But we've also had a number of teletown halls and information sessions with operators as well. And we continue to populate information on some of these pieces online too. At alberta.ca/childcare deal, they can go for more information. But those are some of the areas that you're exactly right, haven't been worked out yet. And I mean, I think we've seen exceptional flexibility and commitment from operators. I'm so grateful, because without them, we could not be doing this.
Thank you very much, Minister. And actually, you read my mind. I was going to ask you about some of those 10,000 new spaces, but you covered that. So I do want to move on to page 15 of your business plan, and still under objective 1.1. And I want to go back to that concept of parent choice. Minister, how important that is in my riding, because you have actually taken the time to sit down with many childcare operators in Brooks, Medicine Hat, and southeastern Alberta, and your team has been exceptionally flexible in making time to listen to the concerns of my constituents. So I just want to say thank you to all department staff as well as ministry staff who are here today, who have really gone the extra mile to make sure that my constituents felt heard by government. So that is definitely a refreshing perspective that we haven't seen in years prior. So I do really appreciate that, and by years prior I mean with the previous government. So thank you very much for that. So this emphasis on parent choice sounds like an important change for parents and guardians across Alberta. One geared towards, of course, letting families choose the childcare program that works best for them. So I'm sure I'm not the only member here on this side who's happy to see that childcare programs with parent choice being at the front of that is important for the Ministry of Children's Services. So why are you doing this? Why is this so important to you, Minister, and how will this impact Alberta parents and families?
That's a good question. And first, I thank you for thanking department staff, because as I look to my left and my right, my Deputy Minister, Sherry Wilson, and ADM, Joni Brozniak, I will say this, in our last conversation with the federal government, they also expressed how surprised, like that there was some surprise at how fast we were able to roll this out. And I said, when I told you we were committed, we were committed. When I told you we had a plan, we had a plan. When I told you we were ready to go, we were ready to go. And it's really only because of the two amazing women to my left and right. And the fact that they're still sitting here beside me is also amazing, given all of the incredible heavy lifting they have done. So, so thank you for thanking them, because I can't tell them how grateful I am, because we wouldn't really be here without them. And so, you know, when we talk about parent choice, that was something that came across loud and clear in the consultations that we had done for our legislation. And I know that that's not necessarily related to the plan, but it's important, because when you undertake a consultation that's that broad, first time in over a decade that we've heard from that sector, and engage them in that way, we needed to take that feedback that we heard, as well as the feedback from the pilot program, about how can we do better? How can we respect what Albertans actually want? And that's things like, you know, it's great. Again, we have an excellent curriculum, but we also know that, you know, some parents want different types of programming, right? There's things like outdoor preschools. Amazing. Cool, creative, great for kids. There should be flexibility for that. Spanish, French, different languages, cultural aspects, all of that needed to be included in this plan, as well as, you know, we look at private operators and not-for-profit. Most parents don't know if they're in a private or non-profit childcare. We heard that from parents loud and clear. What they wanted was high quality. What they cared about was the educators, the safety of the environment that they were in. They didn't necessarily know who was operating and how it operated. And the other point that we tried to make to the federal government, or we did make, and that's why we were successful in including private operators, was because there isn't a correlation between quality or cost, fees, and whether somebody was nonprofit or private. And in many cases, we had examples cited where some of the nonprofit providers, in fact, had the highest fees. You know, and I think that's really the point that we tried to make, and why we were able to get so much flexibility in this agreement. So again, preschool as well, I've talked about that. You know, especially the pandemic has changed the way that people work. Part-time, working from home, preschool's an exceptional option again. And so we're going to continue to invest in that, again, knowing that wage shop-up support for educators, very important for safety. And we also know that obviously childcare doesn't stop at kindergarten, but the most expensive childcare is in 0 to 5, as the federal government has committed to. So we'll continue to invest in those areas as well.
Thank you very much, Minister. As you know, I could probably talk to you all day about this, but I will give the rest of this time to my honourable colleague from Tabor-Warner.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Minister, for being here. I first of all want to say thank you to you and your ministry for helping us get to balance. This is something that the whole government has been willing to work on, and so your ability to do this in your ministry, I thank you for that, and Albertans, thank you for that, and still be able to deliver high quality care to our children. And I wanted to say, you know, your work that you've done on with being able to bring in more spaces for all Albertans rather than just a very few is really commendable. I also wanted to bring your attention, or just ask you a bit about the business plan. On page 16, Now, in 2020-21, you were able to reduce red tape reduction by 23.6%. In 2020-21, in 2021-22, what's that number in terms of reduction? And then my last question that I'll ask you is, I guess you need to hit 33% in order to be able to hit that magic number. Are you on track? And if so, what are some of the exciting red tape reduction initiatives you'll be working on?
Thank you very much for that question, and I do appreciate that. I think, when we talk about what does a balanced budget look like, I think one of the things we were really committed to, certainly at this table, was transforming the system and being okay to make changes. And I often use the example of the changes we made in prevention and early intervention. We heard feedback that government just wasn't working the way that our nonprofits work, and there was red tape and there was uncertainty. And I said, why has nobody changed this then, in 20 some years? And they said, well, because, it's politics. You could answer that question better than me. And so our approach was, if this is better, right? If we have areas that are underserved and we don't have outcomes tied to the dollars that we're investing, how do we know that this is the best for kids? So let's do something that's bold and transformative. And that was really the approach that led to creation of the Family Resource Networks, but also that led to 3-year funding agreements for those nonprofits to reduce tape, which is great. Same thing in the child advocacy centers. I think even the transition to adulthood program, those were changes that are good changes. The changes we're making to therapeutic foster care and kinship care and how we procure services. We're going to get better care for kids in child intervention based on current research, because we weren't afraid to change something and to try something new and to take that research that we have, the best practices that tell us how we should be doing things, and then make those changes and continually improve, because that's our job, is to do things better. Whether that's feedback or whether that's research that tells us the changes need to be made, that's our responsibility. And so, I think that there are some positive things that came out of this, transformational change that we tried to undertake. And so when we look at red tape, it always sounds funny talking about red tape in a human service ministry, but this red tape makes a huge difference for our community partners that serve kids often on our behalf. So we are continuing to work on anticipated or initiatives that help with our anticipated impacts to regulatory requirements. Streamlining inclusive childcare, for example, to make sure we have consistent approaches to supporting kids with high needs. That will be a positive. Reducing the number of forms that operators have to fill out, making sure that we have equal access to services for those who need it most, and that we're not setting up barriers for Albertans who need to come into contact with government or need to access supports and services. Digital services includes things like, I know the member joined me at a childcare center when we changed our subsidy form. Something that used to take 10 days or 2 weeks and definitely transportation and a printer and a fax machine, and now you can do it in 10 minutes on your phone. But continual action is happening there when we come to the family day home agencies, the work that we need to address childcare.
Thank you, Minister. That concludes the government member's first block of questions. We now move to 5 minutes of questions from the official opposition, followed by
5-minute break.
Sorry, the 5-minute break is now? Oh, fresh coffee's ready, everyone? Let's go have a break.
And I will.
Now we move to 5 minutes of questions from the official opposition, followed by 5 minutes of response from the minister. As mentioned, members are asked to advise the chair at the beginning of their rotation if they wish to combine their time with the minister's time. And please remember that the discussion should flow through the chair at all times, regardless of whether or not speaking time is combined. And so now we proceed with member.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to presume the minister still does not want to combine time? No, of course not. Okay, so I'd like to follow up on the 18,500 educators that the minister indicates are currently working in the system. If the minister can clarify how many of those 18,500 are working in preschools, please. I'm going to move on to the issue or the question of the affordability grant, and I appreciate the questions that came from the member from Central Peace Notley regarding this issue. So the government so this addresses line 3.1 of the budget 2022. The government promised to reduce childcare fees for parents by 50% this year. However, the UCP decided to use one flat rate affordability grant to reduce fees for all parents, regardless of where they live and what their fees are. So that means parents in Calgary, where average fee is at least $12.50 a month, or in Edmonton, Fort McMurray, Medicine Hat, Lethbridge, they're actually seeing less than a 50% reduction in their fees. Can the minister please provide a regional breakdown of average childcare fees across Alberta before the new funding model was implemented, and indicate how many parents are actually seeing their childcare fees go down by 50%, and what percentage of parents currently using licensed childcare this represents? I'd like to actually follow up on the questions that were raised by the member from Central Peace Notley about low-income parents. I found it incredibly discouraging to hear the minister in her response in this committee dismiss the very real impact that this is having on low-income families, and she seemed to suggest that it wasn't true that some low-income families are actually paying more, when I'm certain that there actually are, and that if the minister hasn't heard from them, certainly I've heard firsthand from parents and from operators who've spoken to staff within Ministry of Children's Services to lay out how the new funding system has actually led to some low-income families paying more than they were before this funding arrangement was put into place. And in fact, that's a result of the fact that it's a flat one rate affordability grant, but that the subsidy rates have been reduced significantly, along with the part-time rate that has been used by the government to implement this funding. So I have an example of a woman here at Edmonton who is low-income eligible for full subsidy, making less than $50,000 per year as a household, and her childcare fees have gone up $100 per month as a result of this, the way the new funding agreement has rolled out. Another example of a parent who was previously paying $49.54 per month for childcare in, for example, Jasper, is now actually paying $193.35 for childcare, and this is because of the part-time rates and the reduction in the subsidy rates. As the minister is well aware, under the $25 per day pilot program, those parents eligible for full subsidy, as well as the $25 per day cap, actually paid $0 per day. So to the minister, I'd like the minister to address this issue and perhaps consult with her staff to see if they would like to confirm what the minister has said, that it is not true that low-income families are paying more, though actually there are examples where they certainly are. And certainly, I'm wondering if the minister can advise whether her ministry has read the paper done by the Edmonton Council on Early Learning and Care, which talked about how low-income families are actually seeing the lowest reduction in their fees. Even those who are seeing the reduction are seeing a reduction of close to about 20% in their fees, not the 50%. And given the minister has advocated repeatedly that this is incredibly important to her, that the most in need would get the most support, this is not, in fact, how this funding has been rolled out. So how will this budget going forward in 2022 affect that and actually make sure that those lowest income families get the most support? I would also like the minister to report as to whether any analysis has been done as to whether or not the lower fee for affordability grant for day home providers actually results in some day home parents using licensed day homes paying more than if they were using a licensed daycare spot. Because the reduction, and I'm happy to table with this committee examples of how if the average day home rate is $800 in a city and they're actually getting only $300 off of an affordability grant, they're still paying $500 a month, whereas if their daycare fees were $1,000 a month and they're getting the full $650, for example, they're paying less. They're paying $350 a month. So has this incentivized, and was it intentional to incentivize daycares over day homes? And I believe I'm about to run out of time, so I will leave that there.
Thank you very much. Those are some very good questions. First, I would say when it comes to early childhood educators in preschools, as of January 2022, the number of educators, the total educators in preschools is 1,171. When we look at the questions about 3.1 and the reduction, it's important to point out that this is about reducing childcare fees on average right across the province by half. It's difficult to do it region by region because there is, just as there is variation between regions, there is variation within regions. So we had to look at this in terms of, in step one, it's reducing all childcare fees on average by half right across the province to support working parents in every single community. And obviously there will be changes that continue to roll out over the next 5 years. When it comes to lower income families, again, the federal government really wanted to focus on all families seeing a reduction to $10 a day. This is, the fact that we are also doing income testing, that was our choice to do that instead of doing what the former government did, was to pick and choose certain families and certain centers that would be able to access these supports, Madam Chair. And so, I would say that any operator, I would encourage the member, Madam Chair, to maybe reach out when there are examples instead of trying to play politics, because that is what our ministry does. The ADM to my left, ADM Brosniak, this is what her team does, is work through this with parents and with families. And I would encourage the member, instead of trying to create fear and chaos, to reach out to us, and we will absolutely work through this. We do this all of the time. Any operator who believes that they have found an anomaly within the system, our ministry has worked them through exactly what this looks like in terms of the operating grant and the subsidy. We, to date, and I have just confirmed with my ADM, that we to date have not found a situation where a family is not benefiting from this plan. I will say that in part-time care, the under 50 hours on our last town halls, there have been some concerns raised about how those dollars are rolled out. That's something that we committed publicly to work on, and that's exactly why we need the feedback that we're getting from childcare operators and providers to make sure that we are reflecting and taking into consideration the changes that they're seeing. When it also comes to day homes and daycare, this was again based on the averages for each class. So the fees, the operating grants were based on the average fees for each a day home and for a child care center. Again, we know that day home educators provide quality care. They're critical to our childcare system. There is, I've said this before, there's absolutely no way we can get to the 10,000 space goal that we have, Madam Chair, in this fiscal year without bringing more day homes into the system. And we know that a lot of parents make that choice. And so we're going to continue to invest in that area and to take this feedback. I would also say that under the pilot program from the former government, day homes were left out completely. That wasn't really part of the plan. And so we did fight to keep them included. And so again, the grants were based on the average fees for each class. But on average, parents choosing family day homes do pay less than those choosing a facility-based childcare. So we are, however, meeting with representatives from family day home sector as well as family day home operators to address some of the concerns that they have in this area. And again, obviously what we rolled out in January is just step one. April, you know, the new fiscal year includes a plan for the next phase of reducing fees. In year one, the average was really, or the goal was to bring childcare fees down by half on average. And then we committed to working to first an average of $15 a day in all childcare, and again, that's on average, but then eventually working towards the $10 a day goal over the 5 years. But no, so to address the member's question, we have not yet, and that is confirmed by my ADM, seen a family that is in fact paying more, but if you have an example, please reach out.
So much. There we go. And now we go back to, sorry. Oh, Mr. Lowen, it's your turn to address the group. Please proceed.
Okay, thank you very much, appreciate it, and appreciate the comments earlier, Minister. We kind of got cut off, I didn't get to say thanks, but appreciate that. Are we willing to go back and forth again?
You know, it's up to the member. I just don't want, I want to make sure that I get all of your questions in, so if
Yeah.
you'd prefer block to make sure that we don't run out of time to answer your questions.
Yeah, the questions are fairly
Sure.
short, I think, so
Okay.
we should be good there. And then I got one other kind of point to make. So now I did find online the chart on the you know, there's 0 to 119,999 is kind of one set rate as far as I guess rebate or benefit that they receive. Now that is a pretty big gap from 0 to 119,000, and so I guess my question is what percentage of income is each family paying, depending on how much money how much the subsidies are? Now I'm guessing you might not have a chart like that shows that percentage, but if that's something you could undertake, I think that would be fine.
That's a very good question, and so you know, previously that was one of the concerns that was raised with the pilot program as well, is how do we measure things like economic impact, and do these investments actually make the difference for a family that needs to go back to school or wants to take part in the workforce. And so we did procure an outside partner to do some of this work on economic impact, but we're also working with our partners on some surveys that we can share with our childcare operators and parents to get some of that information. We're also working with the Ministry of Jobs, Economy and Innovation to get some of that information as well. And that was something that we, again, felt really strongly, and why we tried in year one to also make sure that we had the subsidy, like we had a subsidy instead of just a basic operating grant. But I would say that this is definitely something that we've considered as we move through each year of the agreement. And so while we've released information on, okay, here's step one, here's the investments we're going to make in year one of this 5-year agreement, there's more to come when it rolls out over time. Yeah.
That sounds good, and I understand that you're under a bit of a pressure from the federal government, kind of wanting to mandate. I guess I look at it as almost like it's a flat tax, almost like a regressive tax, where it doesn't apply like the previous system that we had, which was means tested. So it almost looks like now the left is asking for a flat tax benefit, basically, and where they're normally after the progressive, and this appears like it might be somewhat regressive in the way it's put out.
I would say that the goal was to meet the targets set out by the federal government. There was no way, Alberta parents didn't want us to leave $3.8 billion of their hard-earned tax money on the table to invest in childcare in provinces like Quebec and BC. They wanted to see us essentially sign this deal and bring their tax dollars back. And so it's obviously, I believe it is a way that we could meet the goals of the federal government's program while still maintaining our position on certain aspects of this plan, which did in fact include means testing. And I would say as we continue to roll out future dollars, this operating grant and subsidy is in fact going to change to get those numbers down to the average of $10 a day. It has to, right? And so again, that's going to be based on the feedback that we hear from parents as well as operators, because Albertans' feedback matters to us. This isn't a plan based on ideology. It is a plan that requires the feedback and I think the very thoughtful questions and concerns raised by parents and providers.
I guess what I would like to encourage you is to keep pushing back on the federal government. Obviously, this is somewhat an intrusion into, what's normally a provincial matter dealing with childcare. And of course, it's great that they're willing to put in money, but it's also very frustrating that they're telling us how it's spent. And I can gather from you that you've pushed back and tried to get it more like what we had before, which was means tested, which is something I could support. And I just encourage you to keep pushing back on the federal government on that as much as possible to see if we can get back to where it should be, which would be a true Alberta system. But now we've got kind of a bit of a hybrid. So,
and that's one thing. I know the opposition said a lot, just sign. Like they would have signed on the dotted line, we've seen them do that before, obviously, the Notley-Trudeau alliance, we've all heard alive and well. That's not something that we were really interested in doing. We had to fight for that flexibility, and I am proud of this deal because it is unique. No other province has done what we've been able to do, and yes, did it take us an extra 2 months to sign the deal? Absolutely it did, but did we get a better deal for Alberta parents and operators? Yeah, we did. And so I appreciate your feedback. I think, there are lots of things that we agree on in that, and that's essentially what we'll keep pushing for moving forward is the flexibility to make decisions in an area of provincial jurisdiction while still recognizing the federal government's goals to invest in this area to support labor market participation. Absolutely.
No, that's good. And I think you answered this just in the previous section there, where as far as you can tell, nobody is paying more for daycare now.
Yeah, we have not found, sorry, I think we might have missed that, but there was, we have not found a situation where a parent is paying more. Now, that's not to say there may not be an anomaly, but our ministry and my ADM, Joni Brodsniak, has just confirmed we have not found an example where a parent is paying more. There have been some anomalies in the system. A lot of the examples that were raised were some confusion because, again, it's a new system and the operating grant and subsidy work together in a different way. There has been issues raised with childcare for families accessing less than 50 hours in a month. And again, that is something that when we were looking at this plan and really trying to focus on labor market participation, like how can we actually drive economic recovery? How do we make sure that taxpayer-funded investments are doing what they said they would do? Not just paying $10 a day daycare for people who might already be in daycare, maybe they don't have those affordability challenges. How can we actually make sure that these tax dollars, it's not government money, taxpayer dollars are going to do what we said we would do. So that's why our focus was really on full-time and part-time care. For less than 50 hours, that is something that we are currently working on. We have heard the feedback from childcare operators. I've heard it on our last town halls. And so that's something that is one of our top priorities for this fiscal year to address within how we roll out this plan. So that there might be anomalies in there. Okay. But we haven't seen an example where any parent is paying more in all of the ones that we've looked into.
Perfect. Okay, in your opening comments, you talked about kin care, and that's something a little more near and dear to my heart now. My daughter's taken in two young girls, 5-year-old, 3-year-old, and of course I call them my granddaughters. They call me Papa Todd, and just this last weekend we got to take them to the skating carnival in town and everything. So appreciate your work on that. Obviously, I think that's very important and good. Yeah, good to see these young children being taken care of that are in this situation in their lives. It's very sad to see, but appreciate that. Just one thing I did want to mention quickly is the training courses to do to be a foster parent. They were shut down, I guess, through COVID, or partly shut down through COVID, or restricted at some point, because I knew there were some parents that were trying to get in but couldn't get in because of COVID things. And I just want to make sure, my understanding now that things are back up and running, and I just wondered if there's any backlog there that needs to be taken care of. And I guess going forward, I would hate to see that important work of people that want to become foster parents being restricted because of the pandemic. I think there had to be a way. A lot of courses were done online and things during that time, and that wasn't an option for potential foster parents at that time.
So largely, the training for foster and kinship parents or caregivers had moved online. However, there were some courses like first aid that can't be done online. However, there is no backlog and courses have resumed as normal. Good question.
No, I think that's good. Then I'll cede my time. Thanks.
Thank you.
Minister, is there anything that you wanted to add during this last 30 seconds?
I would just say that, you know, especially when it comes to childcare, I know that there have been a number of questions, Madam Chair, about the rollout. Two things I'd point out. Every province is going to do this differently. When we worked on this agreement with the federal government, we worked on the action plan specifically for the first 2 to 3 years. That's the way that they set this up with every single province across the country, knowing that as we roll this out, we get more information and we're all expected to make changes based on the feedback and what we're actually seeing in the provinces. So I just want to reiterate how grateful I am for the great questions and feedback in this area.
Perfect. Thank you, Minister. We'll now move over to the government members. Please proceed.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you to the Minister for being here with us today and for all of her staff. You guys are doing a great job, and we just want to thank you for being here. Were you prepared to combine the time, or how do you want it? Okay. I want to start by thanking you for coming into my constituency. When was that? About a month and a half ago, or a month ago, whenever it was? Yeah, a month ago. And coming to the Enoch Reserve, and it was just a wonderful afternoon. I really enjoyed it, and I think everybody there did as well. I know that Chief Billy Moran was really happy to have you there, and I know that all the workers in the various facilities, especially in the daycare, were just had a lot of fun.
That's great.
So, and I don't know about you, but as a former educator, being able to see those little ones going through their music class and everything, that was pretty cute. So I want to start then by looking at C92. Okay, and the impact that that's going to have. The federal legislation there obviously says that there's an inherent right for child and family services, that First Nations communities have an inherent right to oversee child and family services. And so I can see on page 16 of the business plan, the key objective 2.2 under the outcome 2, that you've committed to partner with Indigenous governing bodies. I think that the time that we had out at the Enoch Reserve was an example of that. So maybe you could help us understand that how this aligns with the objectives with Bill C-92 and the transition that's going to be coming out of that, and maybe focus in on that word partnership, because I think that's a pretty important thing. So if you could speak to that for a few minutes.
Yeah, and that's a great question. And we did have an excellent afternoon, and I think it was just amazing and encouraging to see the leadership from Chief Moran and how much is happening at Enoch, both when it came, I mean, you know, we toured and learned about prevention and early intervention services, some crisis services, wraparound supports for young people and families who need it, as well as childcare. And when we talk about partnerships, I mean, what you mentioned in terms of just being in a childcare center and seeing kids, I mean, interacting as normal as possibly can, it was amazing. And I think, you know, around, I know your question's about Bill C-92, but I think that there's a pattern in this, how we approach partnerships. You know, we heard that day about, we obviously were days away from a commitment to licensing on reserve childcare facility. There was money in the federal government's budget around an Indigenous ELCC program as well. We tried to get information on that, and they just said, you know, they'll have a separate process. It's yet to come, working through AFN and directly with Indigenous governing bodies. And we just said, okay, great, like, you know, let's cut through that red tape and let's just license this provincially, and let's come to, yes, let's get to a solution. Let's listen to what, you know, in this specific case, this First Nations partner was looking for, and say, how do we do that? And with C92, again, it's the intent of the legislation. You know, there are things, and we've had, I would say, Indigenous governing bodies come to us to say, look, there's going to be things that we might disagree on, but we want to get to yes. And that every Indigenous governing body is going to have a different approach and has different goals. You know, that day we spoke a lot about prevention, early intervention. You know, some Indigenous governing bodies want to, you know, take over responsibility of child intervention kind of starting first. Some want to focus a little bit more on prevention and early intervention. But again, that's not up to us, right? We as a provincial government are here as one of three partners coming together in these agreements to make things work in the way that they work for each individual group. So under this act, you know, we would enter into coordination agreements with First Nations. We have to comply with minimum national standards as outlined in the federal act. I think, you know, the benefit there is their minimum standards in their act are very similar to what we see in the Child, Youth and Family Enhancement Act. We work with federal counterparts to continue to operationalize that act. Right away when that act was released, there were lots of questions around liability funding. What does, you know, data sharing and transferring caseloads look like? We were hoping for some of that flexibility, but instead that's being worked through at, I guess, a more specific level through each individual coordination agreement. But essentially we are committed to engaging with Indigenous communities who are interested in working with us in this area in the way that works best for them.
So I'm going to assume by your answer there, you're talking about the flexibility that you bring to each community. You know, on page 14 of your business plan, it states that the ministry is committed to honoring the cultural aspects of communities and the child involvement in those communities. And so is your ministry, as a part of that flexibility in working with Indigenous communities, is your ministry committed to seeing this outcome for Indigenous children and communities in particular, focusing in on their cultural aspects of each of the communities?
And yes, and so there's two ways that we do that. Like, first of all is making sure that within our own ministry, that our legislation, policy, and practice is being followed, that when a child is not safe in their own home, that we are exhausting every avenue with a First Nation or Indigenous governing body to find a placement, either that is family, a kinship care connection, you know, secondarily in the same community, but essentially all with the goal of keeping kids connected with their cultures and of course their families and communities. But because we know that is what helps drive some of the best outcomes for children and youth in need. We also have training programs that are implemented to support staff at all levels to deliver services in a way that acknowledges historical trauma, community strengths, promotes better outcomes. And so we know that has been a focus. We need to learn and better understand Indigenous cultures, perspectives, and history, and use that as a lens as we move forward in that path. So that's within the ministry, within child intervention, under our legislation. But yes, then too, under Bill C-92, it's respecting that every Indigenous governing body, and you know, that's the definition by the federal government, but we are in discussions with bodies that are either individual nations or they're groups of nations coming together. And again, they take the lead in essentially putting forth their intention to move forward under this bill and outlining what areas they want to focus on first. And so our approach has been to listen and to respect the intentions and the wishes of those nations wanting to move forward, while still making sure that there are things we need to do when we look at, you know, we have federal law, there's a federal law, there are Indigenous laws being created with each of the Indigenous governing bodies, and then we also have our provincial law. And so we need to make sure, I often say, as 3 levels of government are trying to figure out this transition, that no one is falling through the cracks, the transition is smooth, and caseworkers, and oftentimes courts know how to proceed in each of these cases. So the coordination agreement is really important for what that transition is going to look like and how that's going to work in each individual case.
So you did a child and youth well-being review. How does that sort of fit in with all of that? Are there any programs in particular that your ministry has implemented or is implementing that's going to that are aimed at addressing the results of this review? How does that sort of fit into what you've just been talking about?
So we do know, and this was outlined in the Child and Youth Wellbeing Review, that we would say vulnerable or at-risk children and families were disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. Each ministry is now working on their response to that review. The expert panel that we had really gave us some flexibility because we recognize how many different ministries fund and support this work of supporting kids and families. Some of the things like improve access to broadband, that's an announcement, obviously, our colleague, the Minister of Service Alberta, has already announced. That is positive, right? Connectivity, especially in rural communities, making sure that kids have access to that for both, education opportunities, but even sometimes accessing mental health support services. Our ministry continues to do this work. We fund prevention and early intervention. We got really great feedback on the Family Resource Network model in those consultations that we did, which is positive.
Thank you, Minister. We will return now to the official opposition. Please proceed.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to combine the time if the minister is willing.
No.
Was that a yes? I didn't understand.
No.
No. Okay, she said no. All right, then I'll go ahead. Well, I just myself, of course, it's already been acknowledged by most of us about it is Social Work Week, and certainly as a social worker myself for over 30 years, I feel very proud to be part of a profession of 9,000 here in Alberta. Many are in the Ministry of Children's Services, and I know that that ministry has always taken the lead on acknowledging the work of social workers. And certainly as the former Minister of Seniors and Housing, I know there were several social workers in my ministry at that time and continue to work there and across government. So just I want to really acknowledge the tremendous work that social workers do for the provincial government and throughout our province. I want to, focus in the estimates on 2.1, program planning and supports, and really looking at some chronic issues, I would call them, in children's services and the child intervention sector in particular. And I think, I years ago worked in child welfare. I was a caseworker, and I also was a supervisor. And before that, I worked in one of the contracted services that served people directly with very intense supports. It was a family-based treatment program at Catholic Social Services. So, this work that I did at that time really brought me to where I sit today. That's why I became a politician, because I was so devastated by the lack of support and resources for truly vulnerable families. And it inspired me so much that I felt like the fix isn't here at this level. It doesn't seem to matter what I say. It is a political decision. And of course, the minister here is in that role to be able to make a real difference and change things so that vulnerable Alberta families are supported. So I think that that's a very important role, and I know that she's taking it seriously. And I just really want to bring up some issues that, despite it being over 20 years since that happened, since I worked in child welfare, just to use the generic term, many of these things still exist. And we've already articulated some of them. One is high turnover. And high turnover is fundamental in child welfare because you're working with vulnerable families. They may be experiencing mental health challenges, poverty, trauma from colonization. A high percentage of Indigenous families are part of that, so we know, the immense trauma they've been through. They may have had physical, emotional, sexual abuse. We know that, oftentimes, the people that we serve in child welfare don't have a lot of their own resources and are really challenged. So when they get involved in the child welfare system, whichever way they're brought into that, the role of that social worker, hopefully, who's supporting them, is key. And we know that relationship is key. But yet, when 50 to 100% we hear of turnover in workers, how can they develop a relationship with someone? When you have a stack of files, I can just remember seeing this, and they've had 20 workers in the space of sometimes, a year or two. It's pretty disturbing. And of course, that just makes people more and more reticent to, I'm talking about the people we're serving, to be able to develop relationship so that you actually can have influence and can support them. Because you just get shuffled from one worker to another. And certainly, from talking with my colleagues to this day, that continues to be a huge issue. So it's very important for me to hear from the minister what she's doing to create a much more stable environment, supportive environment of social workers so that they are continuing in these roles. And then what she's doing with post-secondary, what kind of relationships with the University of Calgary Faculty of Social Work to actually partner to create programs where she has qualified social workers. Is she connected with the Alberta College of Social Workers, the professional association? What is she doing to understand what's happening in the profession and perhaps why people don't want to work in child welfare, and what can they do to mitigate the issues?
Your honourable member will go to the minister.
Thank you very much. And again, I know this has already been said, but I just want to thank all of our frontline staff in Children's Services for the work that they do, but especially on Social Work Week, and thank the member opposite for her service as a social worker as well. And I think, this is something, and we have talked about this in previous years. It is, I often say that our frontline staff have one of the most difficult jobs in government, unimaginable to most. And so there is training, obviously, at the ministry level, but there's also things like peer support, which has been an important program, essentially mentorship, where staff are supported by people with similar experiences, because being a children's services social worker is a different setting than sometimes what we see in other areas. The PSC also offers a range of programs to support staff who've experienced trauma. There are also, I think, the member mentioned, stability in the workforce, and I think getting feedback from staff has been included in terms of recruitment and retention strategies in various areas, specifically when it comes to rural and remote locations, and how maybe we keep, one of the things I heard is how do we encourage people to stay in some of our remote communities instead of going out, just out of school, move to a rural community for a couple of years and then move into Calgary or Edmonton. And so we've had staff specifically tasked with that. We also see specifically, the member asked about line 3.2. We saw a collective agreement in place that I think helps to stabilize the workforce. That's accounted for in this line item. The majority of our caseworkers are within caseload benchmarks. It is difficult work, but it's also exceptionally rewarding work is what many of our frontline staff have shared with me over the last 3 years, and I acknowledge that. I also think, before we talk about, or, you know, not just talking about what happens within the ministry, but also what happens within post-secondary. I think that was an excellent question as well. We have been working with post-secondary institutions to identify opportunities for internship and recruitment, because we know that that's a partnership that has to happen in order for us to recruit staff. But, you know, just to give you one example, we met with and toured at MRU. So yes, I've met with the University of Calgary. It was great to get their feedback and hear what they're working on, especially when it comes to leading practice and research. It was also really interesting to tour MRU and to hear about things like their simulation lab. You know, how they are really transforming a system to make sure that people who are coming out of a social work program or who are maybe looking at working in child intervention have real life experience. And so I was able to experience where students in these programs were able to essentially role play, walking into a home and looking at, you know, what are you seeing in this home? And then walking through policy and practice, building on strengths based practices and what they're seeing within a house and how to support families, and how sometimes, you know, even role playing, you know, calling on a family to let them know that concerns have been raised. I think that's exceptionally difficult work, and that one-on-one training and that immersive experience where we're really putting, the social work school at Mount Royal University does this amazing job of putting students in that, you know, environment. It's a simulated environment, but actually working through, how do we speak to people? How do we deal with this? What do we look for? What do we prepare for? And, you know, right now, vacancy rate in children's services is just under 5%. Recruitment is prioritized. That is something that, you know, as a position comes open, we work very quickly to fill it. But you know, the last thing I would also say about a program like MRU, what they had shared with us is that the ability to take a 2-year program and then count that towards a degree also helps us get people from, you know, different backgrounds and different communities, and then continue to train them.
Thank you, Minister. We'll move over now to the Government Caucus. Mickey? Amory, I understand that you're going to be asking the questions on behalf of the Government Caucus. Can you hear us?
I most certainly can. Can you hear me okay, Madam Chair?
We don't have volume.
Can you hear me now?
And it doesn't seem to be working, so government side will need you to step in to ask the questions on behalf of Member Amory, who does not have sound.
Okay, I can make this work.
Please proceed.
Okay, thank you. So, Minister, thank you again. I am just looking at, pardon me? Yeah, are you okay if we go back and forth? Okay, thank you. I just want to go back to some questions that I had kind of looked over earlier today. I see in your budget, you have a one-time expense, what I'm assuming is a one-time expense, but maybe you could elaborate, on line item 3.1 in childcare affordability on page 45 of the estimates. I see a $7.5 million allocated for capital projects. Now, from what it looks like to me, it looks like early learning and childcare, but could you provide some additional details on what this will mean for Albertans in need of childcare support? And if you could elaborate on whether or not this is a one-time expense, that would be very helpful as well.
That's a good question. So as we work towards this agreement with the federal government, that line item is specifically around working with our Digital Innovation Office in Service Alberta to design and deliver a new and modern IT system, for lack of better words, that will replace the old legacy childcare IT system. We need it to be simpler. We need it to be responsive in terms of what we're hearing. We have to reduce some of the administrative barriers and make it easier both for operators and parents. this is something that, I mean, just the current infrastructure was aging, but we also, as we roll out this new program, we need some integrated planning and the ability to do that within a digital system. So this will address things like developing online applications to apply for licensing, space creation grants, staff wage top-ups, professional development funding. It also will help us to enhance the childcare lookup tool, which is a tool that we have for parents to find licensed childcare spaces that are available within their communities. And then we also have to rebuild the childcare estimator tool for Albertans so that they can estimate what their subsidy and affordability grant payments, like what their fee is going to look like once they move through that process.
Okay, great. And is MLA Amory ready, or are we still having technical difficulties, Madam Chair?
We don't have that. Please
Okay,
continue.
sounds good. So I'm going to go to page 45 of the estimates on Program 1, Ministry Support Services budget. That, to me, appears to remain flat, but you do have a significant increase in your budget to implement the new Canada-Alberta Canada-wide Early Learning and Childcare Program. So as we know, if things are increasing, we would usually expect funding to increase as well. But I would be interested to know how you're managing to support how are you managing support costs, and is this flat funding rate adequate to address those support costs in your estimation?
Mm-hmm. So that's a good question. The budget for Program 1 is largely Minister's Office, Deputy Minister's Office, and Corporate Services. The budget for these programs will remain consistent, and it's expected to be consistent in the out years moving forward to 2024-25. The majority of the supports within addressing the changes from the Early Learning and Childcare Agreement with Canada are all included in Program 3, and just because they specifically focus within childcare, we will continue to support or look at support costs in this program closely to make sure that the resources are aligned with the the goals that we have set out in the agreement. We got to make sure that we are being as efficient as possible with taxpayer dollars, and we also have to make sure that we're staffed sufficiently to keep that work moving forward and moving forward quickly, as we've shown that we have a willingness to be very ambitious in our rollout of these dollars.
Great, thank you, Minister. I'm just going to pass over the time to Mr. Hunter.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Minister. I just wanted to talk to you or ask you a little bit more information about, on page 45 in the estimates, it talks about child intervention delivery, and it shows a $1 million capital grant commitment. I believe you mentioned that it was the supporting of the Children's Cottage Society project in Calgary. Maybe could you provide us a little more information on that? I imagine you didn't have a lot of capital projects you were able to put forward, but why that one?
So that's a good question, and I think the member, being a Treasury Board colleague, has a little bit of insight into this, but I think it's a great opportunity to talk about one of our community partners that has done exceptional and very important work. This funding to the Children's Cottage Society will support a child and family center that will create space and provide services in it's a 35,000 square foot, 3-story child and family center in Calgary's northwest community of Montgomery. This will be the first of its kind. In addition to current programs that are currently offered in their location right now in Bridgeland, I believe. It's been a while since I toured there, but the work that they do, it's amazing because it covers both child intervention and prevention and early intervention. They provide essentially a crisis nursery where parents who are really struggling can go and children can stay in a safe, supportive, amazing environment while the parents go and work on the things that they need to work on to reduce the stresses in their family so that kids can stay safely at home with their parents. However, they also do provide services while we may be looking for placements within foster or kinship care. So in addition to the current programs that they currently offer, it will also include a 20-bed crisis nursery, a family resource center, therapeutic child development programs, parenting programs, mental health services, and specifically designed cultural programs for Indigenous and Métis young people, and they are working with First Nations, local First Nations in the area on those programs. They raised over half the required funds already. They were looking for a commitment, obviously from the province, as well as other levels of government that they've been working with. But this new building will help the center address the needs of approximately 1,900 children that they have been turning away each and every year. And so I'm grateful. They have worked very hard in terms of raising the dollars, but I think the fact that they have raised dollars from the community and provide both direct child intervention supports as well as prevention early intervention services, that community support shows the impact that they are having, that they are respected and valued within the community. And they came to us with what I think was a very reasonable ask to support essentially a major capital campaign that they have been running in the city of Calgary when it comes to fund development. So I do want to thank them for their great work and their passion over the last 3 years, and just for the great work that they do, and that is included in that budget line item.
Well, thank you, Minister, and I'll turn the time over to Mr. Smith.
I've not heard back from Mr. Amory, but Mr. Amory, if you do want to try, I think they have the audio situation resolved. If you'd like to ask your question. There.
Could I try this one more time, Madam Chair?
Yes.
Can you hear me okay?
Sir, it is working. Please proceed.
Perfect. Thank you very much, and good morning to you, Minister, and I apologize for some of the issues that we've had earlier today. I'll get right to my question. I don't want to spend a ton of time with any preamble, so I want to turn you to page 45 of the estimates. Program for the Early Intervention Services for Child and Youth has a significant investment of almost $130 million for prevention programming. Can you describe to me and the rest of this committee what that entails specifically in terms of prevention programming, and what programs are included in this budget, and how it supports Alberta children and families? And then just continuing on that, what is the $130 million earmarked for, and what type of value are we getting for such a significant and large investment in your budget this time?
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Member Amy, for the questions. When it comes to this $130 million, this includes a couple of things. First is $48 million allocated to youth and transition programs, including Advancing Futures programs, support and financial assistance agreements, and mentoring programs, which we know are very important for young adults who are transitioning into adulthood, who have formerly been in care. $63 million is allocated to the Family Resource Network program, and that is, again, the prevention and early intervention programming that we've invested in. It's made up of 70 networks, so it's 70 networks and 136 agencies in communities right across the province that come together to provide families and children at risk or who may be more vulnerable with the supports that they need.
Thank you, Minister. We return now to the official opposition.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to refer to a recommendation made by the Office of the Child and Youth Advocate last year, which would advise the Minister to reevaluate, or the Ministry to reevaluate and revise policies and practices regarding file transfers and make sure there's a clear escalation process in place to resolve any difficulties. The Ministry's written response to this recommendation was that the current file transfer with policy is fine, but it was not being followed in the specific instance. And this arose out of a mandatory death review. And so I wonder if the Minister can tell this committee why she's satisfied with an outcome where there's a policy of the Ministry that is not being followed. If the problem isn't the policy, then it's the practice, and why she's not, or what she's doing to address that. As well, in Budget 2022, I'm wondering if the Ministry can advise as to how they're responding to the recommendation from the Child and Youth Advocate to hold a forum engaging relevant stakeholders to address actions and results taken under Alberta's Youth Suicide Prevention Plan. The Ministry's response does not seem to commit to holding a forum, and this is a clear recommendation from the Office of the Child and Youth Advocate. I want to advise the committee that in the time period that we have been here in this committee, I've received 3 emails from childcare operators who advised me that they had notified licensing within the Ministry about instances of families who are on low income, who who are actually seeing an increase in their child care fees under the new model, and they have not received a response back from the ministry. So these instances have been told to the ministry. They simply have not heard a response. I'm still waiting to hear from the minister as to how many children are currently enrolled in out-of-school care programs in Alberta. And I'd also like the minister in the time remaining to advise as to why, to also advise whether in budget 2022 and the year coming forward, the ministry is planning to move kinship support work into the department. And what I mean by that is the department now going to be providing kinship supports and moving that work out from contracted service providers? And lastly, there's no reference in the business plan or the budget to any of the recommendations that came from the Child and Youth Wellbeing Review Panel report. When can the Albertans expect to see a government response to that report, as well as clear actions and what actions are outlined in budget 2022? And if we run out of time, I would ask that all of these questions, as well as those that were not answered in previous blocks, be provided in answer to this committee before we consider estimates for vote. Thank you.
Left.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would suggest that for those childcare operators, if you can contact us, call us, and Joni's team will look into those examples. Second of all, we will look to respond to any questions that are in fact related to the budget that have not been answered today. Many of the questions the member just asked are not necessarily related to the budget, but if there are specific questions that are related to the budget, we will look to provide those in written form.
Thank you, Minister. I apologize for the interruption, but I must advise the committee that the time allotted for consideration of the ministry's estimates has concluded. I would like to remind committee members that we are scheduled to meet tomorrow, March 9th, 2022 at 9 a.m. to consider the estimates of the Ministry of Education. Thank you, everyone. This meeting is adjourned.